I didn't hear it. Perfect. Okay. Well, if you've ever met me and know anything about me, I can talk for a really long time because I'm a professor. And so 3 hours is nothing, but I have to say I'm a little out of practice. And so we'll see how that goes. So Amy's going to help me out today because I can't talk for 3 hours straight, but we do have a lot of information to provide you all. And we kind of would like to get an idea, and I don't know the best way to do this really.
Oh, you know what, Brenda, can we pause on that for just a second?
Sure.
If Dr. Watts, if she could share a little bit, that because I know she has another meeting to get to, if she could share about the research project that she's working on or about research in general. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. I appreciate you letting me have a little bit of space. I know you've got a lot to do today. So hi, everyone. I'm Tony Watt. I'm a sociology professor at Texas State. I am not a liaison, but I have worked with Christine for 10 years and seen the amazing work that liaisons do. And I'm the chair of the REACH Research Subcommittee. So I'm trying to do some research with this committee to describe the kind of things that you're doing on college campuses and to try to understand what kind of support you need. We have, and I just want to ask real quick for your help with the survey that we're putting out. So the subcommittee has a grant with the Greater Texas Foundation to be able to describe the level of support that exists on college campuses in Texas for students who've experienced foster care, and to understand how that support may or may not relate to retention and graduation rates on those campuses. So this is the project that we're working on right now. And one of the things that we've done to get started on that is sent out a survey to all liaisons on college campuses in Texas. And you've probably received a link to that survey. Unfortunately, the timing was not great. And I realized that we sent that link to you probably at the two worst times of the semester. One, when you were underwater, and two, when you were coming up and collapsing. So we just want to make a pitch today that if you haven't completed that survey and you're a liaison on a college, campus, or university, I would love it if you could do that. It's probably only about a 15-minute survey. I'll put a link to it in the chat box for you. And if you forget or can't find it, please just email anybody on the REACH board and we'll get that link to you. Just to let you know a little bit about what that survey is about. We are not, it's anonymous, but we are asking if you are comfortable to let us know what campus you're on. But I did want you to know that all of that information is confidential. We're not going to describe any specific campus in terms of what's offered or not. We're just going to aggregate all of those surveys to be able to understand, who is offering a lot, who's offering a little, who's struggling to find any way of offering support. And for those who are struggling to understand what you need, what kind of training do you need, what kind of resources do you need, because we really want to document that for REACH, for the legislature, so that, as REACH moves forward, we can figure out how to best advocate for you and get you the kinds of supports that you need to do this work. So I really appreciate your time. And thank you guys for giving me a little time to make my spiel for the survey. And I'll post the link. And if you have any questions, I'll post my email too as well. So thanks again. Good luck today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tony. Sorry about that. She's doing some really important work, especially as we talk today and talk a little bit about, campus programs and your role as a foster care liaison. It is, and many of you probably already know, having campus support from administrators and people higher up is really, really important to what we do. And it can make our job a lot easier. So it's important for us to kind of know what's out there, what we need, and then we can advocate for that. So thank you, Tony, for your important work and the work that the research team at REACH is doing. So thanks. Okay, well, are we ready to get started, Amy?
Let's do it.
Okay, friends, so I'm going to screen share, or at least I'm going to attempt to. I'm going to be successful after a few tries maybe, but we do have a PowerPoint today that we're going to share with you as we go through. And if you have questions, you can put those in the chat and we'll do our best to kind of monitor that to make sure that we are getting all of your questions answered. We do have a lot of participants today. And so we probably will be doing a lot of talking, but we don't want to really talk at you. We really want to talk to you. That's kind of easier to do when we're face to face. But if you do have a question, chances are someone else also has the same question. So feel free to put that in the chat, and we will monitor that and try to answer those questions as we can. We'll certainly try to save some time today also to answer questions at the end as well. We do anticipate having a couple of breaks also, maybe at the 2 o'clock hour, maybe at the 3 o'clock hour, or sometime in between there where it feels kind of like a good time to stop and take a break. A lot of information is going to be given to you today. For some of you, it will be maybe some review and some information that you already know. For others, it's going to be new. One of the things that Amy and I have discovered is that the liaison role seems to kind of cycle through at some places. And so you may have been doing this for a while, or you might be very new to the role. And our goal is really to make sure that you understand what your role is, you understand the importance of your role, and that you feel supported in that role as well by Education Reach for Texans. But we also find that this is a wonderful network. Amy's at Texas Women's University, and I'm at the University of North Texas, right across town here in Denton. And we rely on each other a lot. If we have questions, we're texting, we're calling, we're meeting. We share students. She's had students that have come to UNT. I've had students that, I'll refer over to TW if it makes more sense for them to be there. And so I think it's just important for us all to know that we're in this together, and that this work can be really challenging, and we recognize that. And we definitely don't want you to feel like you're doing this work alone on your campus. So I'm going to screen share now and see if I can successfully do this. Can everybody see that okay? Thumbs up? All right. So welcome to Foster Care Liaison Training. Oh my gosh, we spelled it wrong on the first slide, 101. We promise this will get better.
I just noticed that, and I just felt like I wanted to make a comment. Like one of the hardest things about this job is spelling the word liaison. Like, seriously.
And further proof that we're just human. We're doing the best we can, right? Just getting through it. So, all right. So what we want to do today is, we feel like the best way, because we have found that there are so many people in higher education who are appointed as the foster care liaison who really don't have a strong understanding of the foster care system. Amy and I actually go way back. We met each other in 1998. I was the program director for CASA of Denton County, and Amy came to CASA as an advocate, a volunteer advocate. And so I actually trained her in October of 1998. So she and I, now we both work in higher ed, but we do go way back. And I have some experience in the child welfare system, having worked at CASA. And I find that it's a complicated system that many people, especially in the community, don't have a very deep understanding of. And so I want to kind of start today by talking a little bit more about that system, just to give you some basic background knowledge on foster care, what it is, and how kids come into care, and what that means for you and the students that you might serve. And so, so what is foster care? So when we talk about foster care, what it is when the court gives legal possession, or what we call conservatorship, or sometimes also called custody, of a child to the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services due to confirmed abuse or neglect. So there's an investigation that takes place. It's a lengthy investigation. CPS will interview the child. They'll interview parents. They'll interview collateral sources, like maybe school teachers or counselors, maybe a neighbor, someone who has knowledge of that child's situation and their current circumstances. And CPS will go and investigate, but they don't typically just remove kids on a whim. Certainly they can remove in an emergency situation, but oftentimes the court is involved and a court order is signed, which allows Child Protective Services to go out and remove that child in confirmed cases of abuse or neglect. Most of the time there's an investigation, and then CPS will go to court, an investigator will go to court and ask a judge for temporary managing conservatorship or temporary custody of a child. to keep them safe, but sometimes they are able to remove an emergency if they see that if they leave that child there for any amount of time, that it could result in serious injury, harm, or death to a child. Foster care is intended to be temporary. It's not something that's supposed to be long-term. In fact, in the state of Texas, we have essentially 12 months to make a decision once a child is put in the legal conservatorship of Child Protective Services, to make a decision about whether or not that child will be returned home or not, and whether or not parental rights might be terminated. Parents are given a what we call a service plan. And in that service plan, they're given and court ordered actually specific tasks that they must complete in order to have their child returned to them, as a way to ensure that they can provide a safe environment for that child. In some cases, that can be extended to 18 months. I'll tell you, because of COVID, some children are staying in care longer because the courts are backed up and haven't been able to have all of the trials and hearings that are necessary to kind of move children through this Child Protective Services conservatorship process. But foster care is in fact intended to be temporary and not a place where youth should grow up. We hope that parents can kind of figure out what went wrong, that they can get appropriate services and support, and that children can be returned to them. So reunification is really the goal. Foster care is intended to protect children from harm or from further harm. And for Child Protective Services to get conservatorship or custody of a child, things in the household really have to reach a point where there is danger of serious harm to a child or even death to a child. And so when we think about our students who have experienced foster care, we know that they have been in a situation that's very dangerous. And many of our students have a lot of physical injuries. Some of them have mental health issues and a lot of trauma as a result of having been placed in harm's way by their guardian or parent. And so we know that there's a lot of support that these students will require. Foster care also may include placing a child in an emergency shelter. This happens quite often when a child is removed. An emergency shelter is a placement that usually is about for 30 days. However, in Texas, this can be extended. I've heard of youth staying in shelters for up to 90 days. That's not uncommon. But they are usually placed in an emergency shelter while Child Protective Services is looking for an appropriate foster placement for them. Most of us are familiar with the term foster home. These are typically homes where folks go out and get specific training. They have to meet minimum standards for youth to be placed in their home. It's intended to be a safe place, and it is a regular family home as we would kind of imagine it to be, but there are a lot of requirements to become a foster parent. And right now in Texas, we have a terrible shortage, really across the country, but a terrible shortage of foster homes, which is resulting in a lot of youth actually living in CPS offices and having to stay in hotels. And so there's a terrible shortage across the state. The other kind of form of placement is a group home. And these are places where there might be multiple kids, there might be 24/7 around the clock supervision, but it's not a typical family home, but a place where multiple youth might live in cottages or pods or things like that. And then we have residential treatment centers. And these are more restrictive settings for youth who actually have maybe some more serious behavioral or emotional challenges that require additional treatment, maybe some medication, maybe 24/7 supervision. Or more commonly, what CPS tries to do nowadays, especially with the shortage of foster homes, is place youth who are in their custody with what we call a kinship caregiver. A kinship caregiver is usually a relative, maybe an aunt, uncle, grandparent, or a fictive kinship caregiver who could be maybe a close family friend, a neighbor, someone who has a relationship with that child. And while CPS still has custody, the child might be placed with that kinship caregiver to put them in a place more familiar to keep them out of a foster home or a group home. Foster care could include what we call extended foster care. And so as foster care liaisons, we're going to see this perhaps more often, where youth who are over the age of 18 can choose to remain in foster care up until age 21. And we'll talk a little bit more about different benefits and services that might be available to the students that you have at your colleges or universities a little bit later on in our presentation. And then also, one of the things that's really important to remember about foster care is, in order for a youth to be in foster care, it requires a court order. And so it's part of a civil court proceeding. That doesn't mean that there may not be criminal charges against a parent or guardian if there's serious injury or death to a child or a child's sibling. But it's a civil court matter where CPS takes temporary managing conservatorship of a child. And so the court is always involved. There are regular court hearings that take place that are required by law when a youth is in foster care. And so it's a pretty significant and serious matter. So how do kids come into CPS custody? Well, many of you might have made referrals. I know we have some K through 12 liaisons on our call today, and so we're so glad to see you guys. What's important is kind of to understand the process. And so reports of child abuse and neglect can be made by phone or on the internet. I have always found making them via the internet is a lot easier, but here is the 800 number. And so if someone from the community, whether it's a teacher, a doctor, a neighbor, suspects that a child is being abused or neglected, what they can do is they can call Child Protective Services and they make a report. And in that report, there will be specific information that is asked about, the child's location, what injuries might have been observed, where the child lives, where the child goes to school, who the child's parents are, what their names are, siblings, things like that. And so CPS tries to get as much information as they can about that child so that they can actually locate the child. So it requires, quite a bit of information. Sometimes making a report.
I think you're on mute, Brenda.
Yeah, can you unmute Brenda?
Yeah, how did I get muted? That was weird. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, that's very strange. Anyway, so the reporter's job is only to suspect, not to prove that the abuse or neglect has occurred. And in fact, reporters aren't encouraged in any way to go ask a lot of questions, but rather to leave it up to the experts of Child Protective Services. So once the report is made, CPS will determine whether or not that's a report that they're going to go out and actually investigate based upon the information that is provided by the reporter. So let's talk about lousy parenting for a minute, because I think one of the things that maybe frustrates the community the most about Child Protective Services, especially I used to hear this a lot with school teachers, is they would see a child in a situation, maybe coming to school with chronic lice, or maybe they came to school with dirty clothes on a regular basis, or with a body odor and it appeared they hadn't been bathed on a regular basis. Maybe the child comes to school hungry. And so if we were together today, what I would do is I would do this exercise that I like to call lousy parenting. And so let's just talk about what lousy parenting is for a minute. So if you have a piece of scratch paper, what I would like to do is have you draw like a T on your scratch paper, okay? And when you draw that T, I want you to kind of think of it as a continuum, all right? And so when we talk about reasons why kids come into foster care, and I think that's going to be my next slide, but we have physical abuse. We have physical neglect, we have medical neglect, we have emotional abuse, we have sexual abuse. There are a lot of reasons why a child might come into foster care and into CPS custody. But if you draw this T, I want us to think about physical abuse for a minute, okay? And so what is the worst thing that could happen to a child who is physically abused? And someone can just say it, because I can't really see you. So you can just unmute yourself and say, what is the worst thing that can happen to a child who is physically abused?
Death.
Death.
That's right. That's right. They could die, right? And that is certainly the worst case scenario. So what I want you to do on the top of your T is I want you to write, and I know this sounds kind of morbid, but I want you to write death. And the reason why we're having this conversation today is because when a child comes into CPS custody, it's very serious. It's not about a parent swatting a kid on the bottom in the grocery store and someone who doesn't believe in spanking calls CPS. CPS is not going to probably go out and investigate a child who's swatted on the rear end for misbehaving in the grocery store. CPS will investigate those things where they feel like a child is in danger of serious physical injury or death, okay? And so when you think about physical abuse, what are some types of physical abuse that a child might encounter? What I want you to do when you think of this as a continuum is at the bottom of your T, I want you to think of that as like maybe the types of physical discipline that a parent may give a child that you think, well, that's a way a parent disciplines, but it may not be that bad, versus at the top of the continuum, the types of physical discipline that you consider to be more serious. So what's something that you might put at the bottom of that continuum that are ways you have seen parents discipline their children, or maybe you disciplined your own children? You don't have to fess up to anything, but that you would consider to be physical discipline that may not be super serious, but acceptable. And y'all can just kind of say that since we're not together. Can anybody think of something?
Spankings or whoopings?
Okay, spankings or whoopings, yeah. So where in the continuum would you put a spanking or a whooping?
At the bottom.
At the bottom? Okay, so that's acceptable. Okay. So spankings or whoopings. What else? What else might a parent do to discipline a child physically, to physically discipline them?
Some parents may slap or punch, which is way at the top. I mean, for a boy, I've heard parents, they'll hit them and punch their son in the chest. I mean, but I guess it's a generation thing.
Right. Hey, Cassie, how are you?
Good, Brenda.
Good to see you.
You too.
Yeah, so slap or punch. So we'll put that higher up on that T, okay, on the continuum. Especially like when you think about if a child is like slapped or punched in the chest or the head, those are more serious areas, right? Compared to like a thigh or on the arm, right? Could do more harm. Okay, what's another form of physical discipline?
Maybe pulling an ear.
Pulling an ear, yeah, that's a good one. I've actually seen that before. So where would you put that one?
I'm not sure. I guess in the middle somewhere.
Okay. And there's no right or wrong answers. Okay, what else?
Shaking or pushing?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Shaking?
Oh, shaking, yes. Where would we put shaking at?
Well, it depends on how small they are.
Yeah,
Yeah, so what if you had a little? Where would you
At
put
the-
shaking?
at the top.
At the top, that's right, Barb. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Good to see you.
Good to
Yeah.
see you.
So if you have a little and you shake the little, that's very serious, because you could certainly seriously injure that child, permanently damaging them, or you could actually cause death quite easily. Okay, so shaking's up at the top. What else?
What about
Pushing.
something like making them hold a physical stance of some sort, on your knees or holding
Oh.
something up or something like that?
Yes, absolutely. And I've actually seen that before in cases that I worked. I remember a child having to kneel on rice while holding a broomstick above their head. That's what a parent had them do. Yeah, that sounds kind of cruel, doesn't it? It's very cruel. And so where would you put that at on our continuum?
Not sure.
I think at the top, because it's physically abusive, but it's also emotionally abusive.
Yeah, there's a lot to that, right? Okay. So holding arms above head, kneeling, making them hold in a position for a long period of time. Okay, what else? How about pinching? Would that be top, bottom, middle?
I think closer to the bottom. Well, again, it depends on how hard, like a pinch in church, maybe isn't as bad as a hard pinch.
Yeah, to get them to be quiet. You don't want them to scream maybe, but you want them to straighten up. So you might pinch them. Okay. So we'll put that kind of down near the bottom. How about biting?
Top.
Top.
Okay.
There are answers in the chat room as well.
Oh, there are? Okay. And I can't see that because I'm screen sharing. So Amy, could you maybe list some of those out?
Sure, I think we've covered a lot of them, but putting children in the corner,
Okay.
extended timeout, using an iron or telephone cord, rinsing a mouth out with soap,
Okay.
slapping, flicking, tapping the hand.
All right. So you guys get the idea, right? There are a lot of things that can happen to kids. Okay. And probably based upon our own experience, probably based upon our own value systems, we would list these things in different places along that continuum. Okay. Typically when we're together, one of the things that I like to do to continue this lousy parenting exercise is I have us talk about sexual abuse. I have us talk about physical neglect and what that is. And I also have you put that on a T with the worst thing possible that could happen to a child while they are being abused or neglected in the same way, being the same outcome potentially as death, right? That's the worst possible thing. So as I line these T's up on, pretend I have a whiteboard, okay? I line these T's up. I like to draw this squiggly line somewhere down near the bottom, okay? Somewhere down at the bottom of our T. You're going to draw a line. And what I like to say is that squiggly line represents lousy parenting, okay? So our students have been removed from their home by Child Protective Services because they are in danger. But there's probably a lot of lousy parenting that goes on that is considered to be acceptable. And it may even, what I might consider, I may not like to spank my kids, right? But I know that when we talked about that as being one of the first things, that's down on the bottom. So, again, how you grew up in your family or what your personal value system is will determine what you consider to be lousy parenting versus not lousy parenting. But for our students, they certainly have probably experienced lousy parenting, but worse than that, they have experienced dangerous parenting. Enough so that the state had to intervene to come in to perhaps save their life. And so it's very serious. And so when we work with these students, I always like to have that in the back of my mind, and ask the question, what happened to them? Because I know that something has happened to them. I know that it was serious and very severe. And, I've had students who've had siblings who've died at the hands of their parents. I have students who have parents, birth parents who are in prison for up to 60 years because of the abuse or neglect. So it's really important to kind of be mindful of where our students are coming from and what their experiences have been. So this next slide here talks about, well, what constitutes abuse or neglect? And it's defined by the Texas Family Code. And so one of the things that we need to remember is it's not always super easy for CPS to gain custody of kids, and they're not out there looking to do that either. And so if anything, Child Protective Services tries really hard to work with families to avoid a removal because it's a very traumatic experience for the child and the family. And we really know that the best place for children to stay, if they can do so safely, is in their family of origin. And so we work really hard to do that. But there are different types of abuse or neglect that you should be aware of. Emotional abuse is really common. And I would argue that any child who's physically abused or physically neglected or sexually abused is probably emotionally abused as well. But it's very uncommon for a child only to be removed because of emotional abuse. It has to be something like, y'all are familiar with Munchausen by proxy, which is also called factitious disorder. That might be, but that's also physical abuse. So I mean, there's, it all kind of melds together in a lot of ways. But just for emotional abuse, most kids are not removed. There's usually more things happening. Honestly, what do y'all think is the most common type of abuse or neglect, or being the reason why a child is removed from parents? That's on this list here. What's the most common one?
Neglectful supervision.
Neglectful supervision, someone said. Okay. What else do y'all think?
Emotional.
Emotional abuse?
Physical abuse because it's more obvious to others.
Physical abuse because it's more obvious. Okay. Anyone else? So a lot of good ideas. You guys are thinking, I love it. It's actually physical neglect. Okay, believe it or not. Most of the kids who are removed are younger, under the age of 5. That's going to be the majority of our kids that are removed. So our students, when they come into care, might be quite young. Okay, but physical neglect can mean a lot of things. It can mean a child who is not necessarily supervised, like neglectful supervision. So you might see those two kind of in tandem as reasons why a child is removed. But physical neglect can include things like no running water or electricity. It could include chronic lice. It could include not enough food in the house. It can include the elements of neglectful supervision, like younger siblings maybe watching, older siblings watching younger siblings at an inappropriate age. And so, a lot of these things you'll find if there's physical neglect, there's also physical abuse. Then later on, we might find out there's sexual abuse. And so it can be pretty messy, but physical neglect is really the reason why a lot of kids come into care. And oftentimes, I find that people look at birth parents and they go, oh, they're just mean, sadistic people. And oftentimes they're not. Actually, there are some reasons why kids come into care, and it often has to do with substance misuse. And it has to do with perhaps a parent being low functioning and just doesn't really understand how to parent. I've seen situations where youth have been removed and they actually have a higher IQ than the parent has. And so the parent just isn't able to care for the child. And it's maybe not intended for ill, but it happens. And so a lot of kids are removed because of physical neglect. Then of course we do have physical abuse, sexual abuse. And oftentimes when kids are removed due to physical abuse or physical neglect, the sexual abuse piece comes out kind of later as the children start to talk and we learn a little bit more about their situation and circumstance.
But I want to add one thing. Alice has noted in the chat talking about physical neglect and supervision because of substance abuse. So thank you, Alice, for making that comment. And we're appreciating all the comments. We love to hear what you know as well. So keep those coming.
Absolutely, because we all educate each other for sure. And you may have had specific experiences that we haven't had. So very important. But there are a lot of reasons, as you can see here, why kids come into care. And one of the things is, I have the Texas Family Code down here. These have to meet the definition in the Texas Family Code in order for a judge to remove the children from their parents or guardians. And so it gets a little bit more complicated. So how does a child enter foster care? Well, a child or youth enters the system when there is reason to believe an allegation of abuse or neglect. So Child Protective Services will get the referral. They assign an investigator. The investigator will go out and, as I mentioned earlier, will talk to parents, guardians, children, observe the child, talk to various collateral sources, and then make a determination about whether or not they feel like the abuse or neglect allegation is accurate and correct. And if there is reason to believe that a child is being abused or neglected, then there's a possibility that they may enter the foster care system. CPS then must petition the court for approval to remove the child from his or her home because of safety concerns. CPS has to make reasonable efforts, however, to safely maintain children with their families before a decision is made to remove a child. Again, if an investigator goes out and sees a child is in immediate danger, they can remove that child in exigent circumstances. However, the law says that they have to make reasonable efforts. So a lot of times what happens is CPS intervenes in the life of a family, sometimes multiple times before there's a removal, because they're able to kind of mitigate the situation and circumstances that are causing trouble for the child and family at the time. So maybe that means that the child needs a referral to a doctor, or maybe the parent needs help with rent or utilities or things like that. Maybe they need parenting classes. Maybe the parent needs counseling. And so a lot of times CPS will work with those families in fact, providing what we call family-based safety services or family preservation services to avoid a removal of a child, okay? And so to ensure that reasonable efforts are made to keep children in their homes, the court, again, gets involved and must approve all decisions to remove a child from their home and for CPS to gain what we call temporary managing conservatorship or custody of the child. And so if the court does decide to remove a child from their home, they may be placed in foster care. We kind of went over these earlier, but kinship caregivers, again, are a priority for CPS to place children with. They like to avoid placing children in foster homes because oftentimes that's with a stranger. And so they want to place the child with someone who they're familiar with, again, like a grandparent, aunt, uncle, maybe even a close family friend or a neighbor in what we call fictive kinship care. And so that really is the priority. Next, they will place them in emergency shelters or foster homes if those are available, group homes, those residential treatment centers, again, if that child has specific emotional or behavioral challenges that require a higher level of care. And then one of the things that we talk about a lot as foster care liaisons in higher ed is when you have a child who turns 18 and chooses to remain in extended foster care up until age 21, that means that a child will continue to have a CPS caseworker that checks on them periodically. And when we have a student who is in extended foster care, they are often part of what we call the Supervised Independent Living Program, or SIL or SIL. You hear it called various things, but the Supervised Independent Living Program is wonderful. And if you all have a student who comes to you who's in extended foster care and is in the SIL program, I tell kids all the time, if they're trying to make that decision and they're on the fence, you know, should I stay in foster care? Should I get out of foster care? The SIL program, Supervised Independent Living Program, is wonderful if you have one in your area. What it does is it allows youth to have their room and board paid for while they're in school. It gives them a ton of money. And they also have an additional case manager that checks in on them. There are various forms of SIL programs. The Texas A&M system has a SIL program where the school actually does provide that case management. There are also places like Texas State or UNT, like at my university, where there's a third-party contractor in our region who provides the case management, but we still work very closely with that contractor who, you know, visits our campus, comes and checks on the student, and provides for their housing and room and board and things like that, pays the bills essentially. And so extended foster care and SIL programs go hand in hand, and they're really wonderful resources for our students. And then,
Brenda, can I add one quick thing on that?
Please do.
Yeah, so we're similar to you, that we have a third party. And if you're thinking about how do I get this going at my university, that's a great question to discuss in your regional breakouts tomorrow. Because it's a win for the university and it's definitely a win for the student.
For sure. Thank you, Amy. And it absolutely is. I love the SIL program because then I know that my students are going to have all of their needs met, you know, for housing and food. And that's usually the first thing that they struggle with if they're going to be struggling, you know, and they can't come to school if they don't have a place to live or if they're about to be evicted. That's really scary. And so that's an important resource for us. And then lastly, you know, I like to talk a little bit about permanency outcomes. And so permanency outcomes for youth, you know, we've already talked about them being in temporary managing conservatorship while they're in foster care. But what happens is if they're not reunited with their family, and I think here's the next slide. So how they exit, if they're not reunited with their family, then oftentimes adoption by a relative or an unrelated person is kind of the next best thing that can happen if you can find a next best thing. We often say the least worst alternative in child welfare. I like to say that because the best interest of a child is really lost when they can no longer stay with their birth family because it's not a safe place for them. But family reunification is always the goal. And a lot of people find that hard to believe, especially, you know, for a child who's been abused or neglected. But I think you will find, if you haven't already with your students, that that youth and children, and young adults are very loyal to their families. Of course they are. We all are. We love our families, and it's no different for them. And I have seen circumstances where parents have kind of gotten it together, right? And they're now well, and they're no longer misusing drugs, or they're getting support for their mental health challenges and things like that. And it can be a safe place for a youth to go back to and have a relationship with their family. If it's not safe for them to do that, because I've seen that as well, we have conversations about boundaries, right, with parents and things like that. I had a student one time whose mom was still using crack cocaine, as she had done when my student was a child, and it was the reason that she was removed by CPS and put in foster care. As a young adult, the mom of my student was still using crack cocaine and was living on the street, and asked my student to co-sign a lease for her. And so we had to talk about whether or not that was a good idea or not, and what repercussions there could be for my student. Again, adoption by a foster family or a relative is the next best thing. And then we have what's called permanent managing conservatorship. And this is never really a great thing, but it's necessary sometimes. And it is a permanency outcome for some students of ours who may ultimately end up aging out of the foster care system. But when CPS is no longer able to, they have temporary managing conservatorship, but after about that 12 months to 18 months that we talked about earlier, that the court system kind of has to figure out, are we going to terminate parents' rights or not terminate them? If they do end up terminating parents' rights, yet there's not an adoptive home or a family member or a kinship caregiver who can take the child, CPS will get permanent managing conservatorship of the child, and that child will remain in foster care. Or sometimes they give permanent managing conservatorship to a relative or another suitable individual. And so that sometimes is an outcome that we see happen with our students. And then the last thing over here, where you see the blue check mark, is adult living or alternative long-term living arrangements, or what we also call independent living. And this is going to be a situation where maybe Child Protective Services got permanent managing conservatorship of a child, was granted that by the court because there wasn't an appropriate person for the child to live with, or an appropriate person to get custody of the child. And so that youth is going to likely age out of the foster care system, and then we find them on our college campuses. I think the whole point of us talking about these permanency outcomes, I always liken student circumstances and situations to financial aid. And that's something we in higher ed can all relate to. Every student's financial aid package is just a little bit different. Every youth's outcome when they're exiting foster care can be a little bit different. And what that youth might be eligible for later on down the road when they seek a higher education experience is a little bit different based upon their permanency outcome, because it will determine maybe what benefits they actually qualify for.
Thank you, Brenda. I had a comment and a question on that section. One comment is some of these issues really surface at times that might be a little unpredictable. For example, graduation. So I've noticed students that when they're preparing for commencement, that's when they really want to reconnect with their biological families. And a lot of times that can be really disappointing if it doesn't turn out the way that they're hoping that it will. So it's helpful to know their expectations and what their experience is, as much as they want to share it, to be able to help them prepare for that. And then the second thing is, Brenda, we had a question about kinship placements and what kind of training those families are required to have before a youth is placed with them.
Assuming that we're experts, which we may not be here, but oftentimes for kinship caregivers, I'm not aware, and if there's anyone from Child Protective Services on this call who can correct us or give more insight, feel free. But in my experience, kinship caregivers don't necessarily have any additional training like a foster parent might. A kinship caregiver could choose to become a licensed foster parent, which would allow them to get perhaps some benefits like reimbursement for having that child in their home, kind of like a foster parent would get monthly foster care payments reimbursing for the care of that child in their home. But the kinship caregiver typically wouldn't necessarily get a great deal of training unless they sought that out and chose to become a licensed foster parent. And there are some good reasons to become a licensed foster parent, but many may choose not to do that. Does anyone else, I don't know if there's anyone from CPS on the call who might have anything else.
They're
on
saying
that.
a home study must be done.
Yes, a home study definitely must be done, and they have to go through a process in order to become a licensed foster parent. But also for a kinship caregiver, they do have to have a home study. So someone will come in and check out the home just to make sure it's safe to place that child in the kinship placement.
Right.
And I can't see the chat, Amy, since I'm screen sharing, so I'm sorry that I can't read all those.
That's okay, no problem. Okay, so the next section, I think we'll do this next section and then we'll take a break if that sounds good. So Brenda has done a great job of laying the foundation to help us understand the kind of trauma that these students may have experienced or likely did. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes them unique. So one kind of opening comment, I think all of us who are working in education know every student is unique. And to follow up on Brenda's point, just like their financial aid packages, their histories, all of them are unique, but there's some generalizations that are helpful when we're thinking about this population. And one of them is just the numbers. So 2020, over 1,200 youth aged out of foster care. And so let's look at, next slide, please. Thank you. I think these statistics are really interesting and compelling for why we need to do the work that we're doing. So the first one, 25% will experience homelessness before their 22nd birthday. A third on public assistance, 40 will not have completed high school, 50% will be unemployed. Within 18 months, 60% of women will have a child. And then this one, the one that we're really trying to address, is 70% of youth leaving care report they want to go to college. They have the desire to do that, but in reality, less than 3% actually obtain that degree. And these are just very grounding statistics to help us realize why we need to do this work and why organizations like Education Reach for Texans matter, because this nonprofit is trying to make a difference with that. So we're so glad that y'all are part of this conversation today. Okay, mental health. So as you can imagine from all of the information that Brenda gave you, where we have an understanding and appreciation of the trauma that these young people have received, if you think about your developing brain and you think about that kind of trauma, I mean, I don't think it's hard to conclude there's going to be an impact to your mental health. So the tough news is that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is 6 times the national average for people who've experienced foster care versus the general population. And there's been research to show it's as high as veterans returning from war. But on the positive side, the recovery rates are greater and that there's really a lot of evidence coming out about the resiliency. So we don't want to forget that part. We don't want to forget that about how strong and resilient these students are. And that the mental health needs are something that we have to keep in the front of our work when we're working with students. So on one hand, we don't want to make an assumption that a student you might be working with has a mental health need, but we do need to have an awareness about doing a needs assessment to make sure they're getting what they need. And with that, let's talk about education and employment. So foster youth obtain a GED credential at 6 times the general population. And for those of you in K-12, you probably understand this as well as anybody, that this really impacts their earning potential. And it also becomes a barrier for getting into higher ed. And that's one of the, I guess I would say, poignant parts of what's happening in Texas. I mean, Texas, that we have this foster care waiver that they can go have a lifetime tuition and fee waive, free tuition and their fees waived. And yet if they don't know about it, if they've not felt encouraged or empowered, that can just be a lost waiver. So I'm seeing something about the stats on leaving care. Mary Jo, I'll put that in the chat when I have a second here. Let's see. And then you can just see, I mean, I think the main point on this is to say that 2 things. One, that while no one really wants the experience of being put up on a pedestal, I mean, that experience makes a person feel separated or other. So we don't want to put people up on pedestals. But on the other hand, we also need to recognize the resiliency of these students, and that when they are coming to us wanting to enroll in higher ed, we need to eliminate as many barriers on our side to make it possible for them. That these challenges that they have might mean that they need to start at a community college, or it might mean that they want to pursue some vocational or certificates. All of these options are totally legitimate. I think the thing that you need to remember is taking the time to have the conversation with the student to figure out what's best. So as Brenda had mentioned earlier, we have referred students back and forth. Our dear colleague, Dr. Del Rio is on here from NCTC. We've worked with students in those ways. And so that the student, just like any student, higher education can be an overwhelming bureaucracy, but I think especially for our students who've experienced foster care, just knowing where to start and what makes sense, that requires time on our part to listen and hear what they need and then help match. Okay, so just to take a broader picture on the next slide. This was helpful for me because I met Brenda when I moved to Texas. Having worked in Ohio, I didn't know how things were organized in Texas, and then getting into higher ed, it's like, how do all these pieces fit together? So while we're not going to go into all these areas of the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, it's kind of helpful to know how all the pieces fit together. And this is especially helpful when you're working with a student. They might be sharing about an experience they had or somebody that they worked with, then you kind of understand, like, okay, so the big umbrella is DFPS, and under that are these 5 departments. And then you can kind of see how the pieces fit together. Your role as a liaison is you do not need to become an expert in any of this. This conversation is really meant to provide you some background and context, but don't feel like you have to become an expert. That's why we keep deferring into the chat, like, who out there knows this? Because there is a lot to know. And speaking of a lot to know and who to know, this is a map of the state and how the regions are defined. And so Brenda and I are in region 3, which is, so she's highlighted that, you can see with the arrow as an example so that you can see all the counties that make up region 3. You can see in the bigger square, the darker lines that kind of help you see which region either your university or college or school might be in, or where your student is coming from. Tomorrow, you're going to have an opportunity to meet the other people in your region, which we think is going to be really practical and helpful, because that's really where this is the groundwork for that, but it's really working with people in your area to meet the best needs of students, to meet them where they're at. And so this might be a good stopping point. What do you think, Brenda?
Sure, that sounds like a good one.
So should we take a 5-minute break and come back at 2:05? Oh, someone's asking, what are the stars?
The stars. Those might be the regional offices. I think that's what that stands for, kind of indicates are the regional offices for each of the DFPS regions across the state. So we're in region 3, the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so Arlington is actually where our regional office is. So you can see that's where the star is in Tarrant County.
Great, and then Mary Jo had a question I'll follow up on when I have a second. And I think that's all the questions. So let's everybody stretch, get a glass of water, and let's come back at 2:05.
All right, we'll see you in a few.
Okay, thanks.
So hard to see when you're screen sharing.
That's really hard.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that.
Oh, sure.
Do you need anything? Do you feel like it's going okay?
Yeah, no, I think we're okay.
So when you screen share, you can't see the chat, can you?
Well, I have found it. It's like up near the top.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm always afraid to like press buttons on these things.
Right.
I'm sure you'd think I'd be a pro at this after a year of online. I miss not seeing faces of everyone.
Yeah, I know, and being able to do activities.
Yeah, it'll be better next year. We'll be back.
We'll be back. But and a lot of people are getting to participate this year.
Yeah, which is super nice.
So one of the things I don't think you were able to see in the chat is there was some discussion about McKinney-Bento, and if a student is in a shelter, do you have to code them under McKinney-Bento? And so I asked someone K-12 to respond, and they did.
Okay,
So that's good.
very much so. Hmm.
You know, I was thinking, Brenda, we had a slide on trauma-informed practices, but we don't.
I don't know. You know, it's been a couple of years.
Right.
I've slept a lot, honestly, but that would be,
I could talk about it briefly on the
yeah,
after the Casey stuff.
yeah, that sounds like a very good idea. Thank you.
Sure. I wish I'd thought of it sooner. It's okay.
Oops.
It's 5 after, Brenda, whenever you want to
Continue on.
continue on.
Okay. All right. Do we have most of our people back, it looks like?
It looks like it, yes.
Okay, I'm going to welcome everybody back at this time. I see a lot of empty seats and blank walls, but I know you'll be joining us here as soon as you can get back with your drinks and things like that. The next part of our presentation, we are going to talk a little bit about higher education, foster care liaisons, and kind of how we came about. And so Amy and I have been doing this for quite a while. I started working with students who have lived experience in foster care on my campus back in 2011 was when I kind of first had this epiphany that, wow, we need to be supporting this student group a little bit better. And so in 2012, I really kind of dug in a little bit deeper, started meeting some students who had been in foster care, some adopted, some aged out. I've been working with them, connecting them with resources and services at that point, and even had done some grant writing and fundraising and presentations in the community to educate CPS workers, CASA advocates, counselors, therapists, and attorneys who represent kids. And I remember one day getting this phone call from my Division of Student Affairs, someone in the Division of Student Affairs at the University of North Texas. And they said they were talking about the legislative session and House Bill 3748. So this came about in the 84th legislature, which was 2015, I believe. And House Bill 3748 was ultimately passed. And what it stated was that each institution of higher education in Texas had to appoint at least one employee to serve as a liaison for students who were formerly in the conservatorship of the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services. Well, imagine my joy in learning about this bill after I had been supporting these students for the last, 3 or 4 years on my campus. I used to call it my volunteer work at work because that's kind of what it was in a lot of ways. But what House Bill 3748 did was it legitimized the work that I was doing on campus, and I was thrilled because what it really did was it helped, student affairs and student life and university presidents. It really brought a lot of attention to this particular student group that I, of course, felt very passionate about and was already serving. And so that one person that ended up being appointed was me, of course, at the time. And I was glad to be the liaison because, again, I was doing that work on my campus already, reaching out to these students and trying to support them as best I could. So fast forward then a couple years later, in the 86th legislative session, House Bill 1702 was passed. And really there was great advocacy for this particular bill, because what we found as foster care liaisons was that our campuses really didn't quite understand what our role was and what we could do or couldn't do. I was really fortunate to be at a university that was supportive and was able to help me get a list of students who were on the tuition and fee waiver at my university so that I could identify who these students were. But I'm also aware that there were campuses where people like liaisons had a really hard time getting that list of students to figure out just who they needed to be supporting. And so House Bill 72 really rectified this situation. And it stated that the institution shall identify those students from information in admissions or financial aid applications or other available resources, such as the tuition and fee waiver letter. And so every semester after the 12th class day, I'm able to, and you should be able to, go to your student financial services office, your bursar's office, and get information about the students on your campus and a list of who receives that tuition and fee waiver so that you can reach out to those students and offer support and help for them as we are supposed to do as foster care liaisons. And so that's really important. This bill 1702 also included information about training. So Amy and I have been doing this training, I don't know, for like 4 or 5, 6 years now, Amy, I'm not sure. But we do it every year for the Education Reach for Texans annual convening. And this is one of the few trainings in the state of Texas that actually is specifically for higher ed foster care liaisons to kind of give you an idea of how you might support students on your campus and how to start campus support programs, student organizations, and kind of what your role and duties are as a foster care liaison per the Texas Education Code. And so the training is intended to help with that. It also allowed for publicizing campus resources. So essentially we have to publicize that we have a foster care liaison on our campus and who that person is. And hopefully, if you're on a campus where your liaison changes, then that is also published correctly, because people might be looking for the liaison but not find the right person. And so that can be really difficult and frustrating for students and caregivers, or perhaps even caseworkers that are working with students trying to get them into college. And then also we need to have the foster care liaison information. That's really important. So we as higher education institutions are really required to obtain the names of current and incoming students who were formerly in CPS custody. We need to be able to provide the information about the institution's liaison officer who's responsible for assisting those students who were formerly in foster care. We should be able to attend training so that we know how to fulfill this very important role. And then we should also somewhere, our universities or colleges should publicize our names and our contact information so that we can let people know what those available support services are on our campus. One of the things about foster care liaisons also is that the Texas Education Code says that any public technical institute, any public junior or community college, any public senior college or university, any publicly funded medical or dental unit, or any public state college or other educational institution as defined by law must have a higher ed liaison that reaches out and attempts to support students on our campus. So this is really important, and we want to make sure that we are providing our foster care liaisons all the services possible. So what are some of our duties per the Texas Education Code? Well, we provide information to foster care alumni regarding support services, and specifically those resources and benefits that are provided through the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's like that financial aid package. Every student that comes to you is likely to be eligible for something just slightly different. And a lot of that gets a little bit complicated. And so we do have some information about benefits at the end of this, the end of the PowerPoint, and we're happy to share that PowerPoint with you all. There are also some other resources that we will share with you that will help you kind of navigate your role as a liaison officer. But I often find the resources and benefits to be really confusing, because you literally have to know, from a student, did you age out? How old were you when you entered care? How long were you in care? Were you a student who was adopted? Because that means you qualify for this, but you may not qualify for that. And so we really have to help students navigate what resources are available to them and what benefits they're eligible for based upon their own individual circumstances. So that's a major duty that we have as foster care liaisons. So if you don't know anything about the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, we hope to share a little bit about that with you today, but also share those resources with you so you can dig a little bit deeper, because we won't be able to hit on all of the specifics. Also, we would need to inform foster care alumni about other resources available at the institution. And, I'm a clinical social worker. I came from a practice background. I've been at the university for about 11 years. And I, on the daily, am just like so amazed at all of the resources that our college and university campuses can provide our students. And I think those resources are growing and growing and growing because our student needs are getting greater. And that's true for all of our students, but it's particularly true for our students who have experienced foster care. And so we need to make sure that when we have a student that has a housing issue or a financial aid issue, or maybe an academic issue, that we're providing them the relevant information that our campuses, and information about resources on our campuses to assist our students so that they can be the most successful possible. So I've kind of broken it down here because when we talk about duties of the liaison, that was kind of it in general. But on our campuses, we really have a lot of coordination. And I know on my campus, we have over 200 students who have identified as having experienced foster care. And so it can get a little bit crazy and busy sometimes around here, but it does require a lot of coordination. And so what we do is we want to make sure that we're coordinating our interactions between our foster care alumni and any faculty or staff on our campus who can provide specific needs for our students. And again, those resources, whether it's financial aid, housing, dining, counseling and testing. If our student needs disability access, how do we get them that? Would they be appropriate for the TRIO program? Do they need to be referred to the Student Money Management Center? Are they looking for a job? Do we send them to the Career Center to get help with their resume and cover letter? And so on campus, obviously we have all those resources. We're kind of helping direct students to those resources. Off campus, we collaborate with other higher education professionals who are interested in networking. I mean, Education Reach for Texans provides this wonderful network, and I honestly don't know as a liaison what I would do without my tribe, because they're super helpful. If I ever have a question about a student or a question about a resource, I know I can reach out to any of my colleagues who are part of Education Reach and who are foster care liaisons and get the answer. And sometimes it's tough, sometimes it's difficult, and the answers don't come easy, but having that collaborative network is really priceless and something that I hope all of you can do and aren't afraid to reach out to someone and ask a question. There's no silly question because chances are we've all had the same question. And so it's okay to ask those. We also work carefully with foster care liaisons at local independent school districts or charter schools, because they know who the youth who are in foster care are on their campuses. And they know what the educational goals of those youth are. And if they plan on coming to community college, or if they plan on coming to a four-year institution or a technical or vocational school, they're the ones who kind of help direct them. And then I like to think of it as a warm handoff, which is so cool, right? When we have K through 12 liaisons and then higher ed liaisons, it's real easy for these students to fall through the cracks. You know, there's this net that's pretty wide, and we want to make sure that we have these warm handoffs to make it as easy as possible for students, whether they're coming from high school, whether they're coming and transferring from a community college to a four-year institution. We want to wrap around them and make sure they have the support that they need. We also do a lot of collaboration with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, who keeps a list of liaisons for the public to kind of figure out, you know, who is the liaison on each campus. We work with the Texas Education Agency, and then obviously we work all the time with stakeholders from the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services. We work with court-appointed special advocates or CASA volunteers who might be serving the youth while they're in foster care. Child placing agencies, which are foster homes that are licensed foster homes that aren't licensed through CPS. And so there are a bunch of stakeholders that we end up working with. And so being part of that network, I would say, is invaluable. I have good relationships with a lot of CPS workers, a lot of preparation for adult living workers, case workers who work with our older youth. And they're really helpful, especially if you have questions about a student's particular circumstance while they were in foster care, making sure they get their tuition and fee waiver letter so they can submit that to Student Financial Services on your campus. All those things are really important. So having a network as a higher education liaison is very helpful. All right, Amy.
Great, thank you, Brenda. That's the perfect segue. It's almost like we planned it. So several folks, Dee and Susan in the chat, were mentioning that they need their foster care liaison info updated on the list. And I've shared that I personally have had trouble with that as well. So David's asking, where can I find this list? So if you go to Education Reach for Texans, we have a link there, but you can also find it in College for All Texans. Here, I can look it up really quickly. Or Brenda, can you or Jessica look it up really quickly while I continue on the slide? We'll put the link there, because that would be great if y'all could. Thank you, Susan.
Yes,
so you can see this is an issue that the board for Reach is concerned about, that it's difficult to have this list updated. And then it's so important because, I mean, ideally, students are going to be referred to this list so they get connected with us. Because the one thing that we know is having a single person they can start with makes such a difference. And so with that, I'm going to talk about how do you identify foster care students. And I actually want to take a step back for a minute and talk about, like, we've had kind of this understanding of what the experience of being in foster care was like for all the different ways Brenda described. But when you meet with a student, they may not have a neat and tidy way to describe their experience. In other words, I work with a lot of students in our program who are not on the tuition and fee waiver. So there are many of these benefits, which we'll get into the details of the benefits at the end, have specific criteria. And so you will have, I'm sure, times that you're working with students who have experienced these traumas, but they may not be receiving the benefits. And that's important to know, because as I give you this, what looks like a very thorough list of ways to find students, you're still not going to find everybody this way. But this is a systematic way to start. And that's the first thing I would do is just what Brenda said, which is to request that list from financial aid and your registrar, or on your campus, it might be business services. Now that the legislation has passed, this is so much easier than it used to be. There used to be resistance, not because these departments didn't want to share this information, but because they thought they were not permitted to do so. So that's really helpful. And figuring out who on your campus, what office collects this information is going to be really key. It'll really make your job a lot easier if you can get this list every single semester. Same thing with FAFSA. If you can get a connection in your financial aid, that they'll send you the list of people of students who, one, check that they were in foster care. Also, if they check that they're independent. because that might be where you find some students that have experienced foster care as well. The education and training voucher recipients, again, that's another benefit. So getting a list of students who receive those benefits. Admissions is a great partner because, first of all, just as Brenda was describing these warm handoffs, if you as the liaison can get connected with a student even before they're a student here, even when they're in that prospective process, it really, first of all, helps you eliminate any kind of unnecessary hiccups or bumps or obstacles that they might hit, but also starts forming that relationship from the very beginning where they can really count on you. And then, of course, the visuals before COVID were posters and flyers and brochures. Having a great, it doesn't even have to be great, but just having something on your website that makes it easy for them to find you. I mean, I think our websites really are our front doors. So when students are Googling on your university or college website, are they able to find you? I'm going to talk about Campus Champions a little bit more on the next slide. New student orientation. This is another way, especially if your university requires, if it's a mandate that students go to orientation, it's another possible point where you can make a connection. And the student organizations. One of the things I love about having a student organization is students are so good at finding each other, and that provides you the structure to allow that to happen. Okay, and I see that someone's asking about the copy of the PowerPoint. We're definitely going to share that. And also on a quick side, at the very first slide, we showed a picture of a guidebook. That guidebook is on the Reach website, and it's a guidebook for liaisons, and it lays out a lot of what we're talking about this afternoon. And you have access to that on the website. FERPA. So if you are intimidated by FERPA, maybe intimidated is not quite the right word, but I remember that's how I felt about it when I first started working with this population. So my context is a little bit different from Brenda's. We actually were awarded a grant to start our program. It wasn't in my office. It was operated out of the vice president's office. And so they were able to lay some groundwork. And then when the grant ended, then that's when the program came to me. So Brenda and I have a lot of similarities in terms of trying to find resources, and we share community resources. Really, I just love that with each other so that we can try to meet some of the needs of the students. And I'm positioned in student affairs or in student life. So that's where our office is, working with students. So depending on your financial aid office and some of your other offices, they may have a very, I'll say, narrow interpretation of FERPA. And it's just so important to get a relationship with your key FERPA people on campus, because FERPA was never intended to separate professionals on a college or university from assisting a student. That's not the purpose of FERPA. FERPA is to protect the privacy rights of the student. So if what I'm trying to do by getting this list of these students is to provide a service for them in a way that does nothing to diminish or threaten their privacy, not allowing me to do that is actually not what FERPA is about. So sometimes if you can flip it, you can get people to open up. But the main thing I would say that I did, though, is I just found out who every campus or university has a person who's ultimately accountable for FERPA. It's usually the registrar. Become friends with the registrar, go through all the trainings so that people know that you're not going to do anything to put the university, to compromise the university's position on FERPA. And we can go on and on about FERPA, but we'll leave it at that. Okay, so you're thinking, okay, this is a lot of information. Brenda laid out what the duties are. I want to get a program going. I'm just not even really sure to where to begin. So the Casey Family Programs really has created the Sterling Silver model. And that's what we're going to be sharing with you. You can Google it. It's in the guidebook that you can get on our website, but these are kind of the high points. I want to share this, though, from a perspective of don't feel overwhelmed. If you just take a few of these nuggets and start the service that you do, especially if you stay in touch with the people in your region and you attend these trainings, you're going to be okay. Because sometimes when you go to a conference and you see these models, you're like, holy moly, I'm an office of one, and this is one of 10,000 tasks and duties I have. So this is meant to be supportive and not meant to overwhelm you. But one super important thing is a designated point of contact, which Texas actually has made easy, since every institution has to have a designated point of contact. And that for a lot of you is you are the liaison. So just being you and being available for a student to have someone in touch, that's a huge victory. Even if you don't know the answer, that's the thing. The students know I can just keep coming back to Amy. I can keep coming back to Amy. She doesn't know the answer, but she'll get back with me. There's value in that. Second priority, in my opinion, are the campus champions. This work is complicated. Students have complicated things we're trying to sort out. Each situation is unique. And so having other people help you problem solve is really key. And we're going to talk, well, you can see on the bottom of the slide where it says phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Brenda and I were looking at that and kind of joking, because I could not have waited to phase 2 for financial aid. Like we needed a partner and an ally in financial aid right away because we had so many questions. And so once we were able to get that, it's better for financial aid because they're not having students ask all these one-off questions now that we're more educated, and it's better for the student. So I would say, and Brenda we were talking earlier, was saying housing and financial aid, and then advising. We want our students to get advised so they're really right on track for what's their best academic fit. And then in the next phases, you can kind of expand out. And so speaking of expanding out, this slide shows you, like this is really the premier model, which has you can see the outer ring. These are what I would call the bigger buckets or themes. And as you are able to add more resources, then you can flesh out this diagram. It's sort of hard to read, but it's like planned transitions, personal guidance, and then student engagement and leadership. And then as you move in from there, academic advising and counseling, financial aid, housing, and other basic needs. And then to get to that, on that innermost circle, internal and external champions, developmental leadership, staff peer support and development. So this is an illustration of the important elements of a program. You're going to know what's the best fit for the culture of your campus and for your students. And this is really meant to provide for you, an illustration of what that might look like. With the caveat, like, don't be overwhelmed by this. If you start with those two first things of single point of contact and finding those campus champions, you're going to be well on your way. So this, looking at, if you had to boil it down to the core elements, I think this provides some clarity on how to make this happen. Designated leadership. So one thing that Brenda and I think Roxanne would agree as well at North Central Texas College, is having designated leadership and senior leadership support. If you have that, that'll make your job a lot easier, because we all know it's resources. Everybody is, clamoring for resources, and it does take some resources to have a program like this. I look at our program only has 50 students, and I have a person who half their time is dedicated to supporting these students. That's pretty resource heavy. So you have to have some buy-in to be able to do that. But if you don't have that, don't despair, because having those champions within your institution, out in the community, all of these things will grow your program. And one other comment I want to make on this is, so this year at Reach, this is our virtual conference, as you all know, obviously. And so it's a condensed experience. When we're in person, we have many more sessions, and you'll be able to meet many more people. And one of the sessions we typically have is on trauma-informed practices. And I just want to take a quick break to talk about that for just a second, because as Brenda described, what these students have experienced, even if you don't know all of the ins and outs of their individual experience, you do know that they have experienced trauma. And so we want to operate from a perspective that's trauma informed. And the number one principle of that is do no harm. We don't want to make things worse for students that have experienced trauma. We want them to have an experience of safety, of trustworthiness. That's why I said, even if I don't know the answer, I want to be responsive so that they know that they can count on that. And empowerment, we want their voice to be front and center as they're making these decisions. This is their choice. We're just guiding them and providing the information for that. Okay, and one of the ways we do that is with student organizations. So I'll hand it back over to Brenda.
All right. Well, I love how Amy kind of gave the segue for this. We're like she completes me when it comes to presentations. But so we really did start our campus programs out very differently. And as she alluded to earlier, Texas Women's University actually got a grant to start their program. And I honestly remember feeling so jealous because I was just, as I said, it was my volunteer work at work. I was just trying to support students as I was becoming aware that they had, specific needs, that they had experienced foster care. I knew a little bit about foster care. So I kind of knew where they were coming from. And so what I did was I actually came to know of a young lady who made like a 1400 on her SAT. And she had aged out of foster care. She'd come to UNT. And then 2 years later, I'm kind of searching for her. And I do get in touch with her and I find out she's not there anymore. And I'm thinking, man, that's terrible. How could she have, aged out of the foster care system? She had really good support while she was in care from her ad litem, from her CASA volunteer, from her placement. And she was academically very successful and could handle the rigor of higher education. But once she got to UNT, for some reason, it didn't work out for her. And it really ended up being kind of the social, emotional, financial pieces of it, not just going to class. And so as I'm kind of lamenting this particular student, I find out and meet a couple of other students who had experienced foster care. And I decided to take it to the dean of students because, I'm thinking I'm a social worker. I think programmatically. I came from a nonprofit. We need to support these students on our campus. And so I went to the dean of students and I said, we need to start a program that supports foster care alumni on our campus. And instead of starting the program, because, that takes money, and I had none at the time, they said, why don't you start a student organization? It sounds to me like you need to do that. And I remember thinking, oh no, not a student organization. That means I'm going to have to be the advisor. And sure enough, all these years later, I'm still the advisor, almost 10 years. But we started a student organization, and it became really, really a helpful piece of how we started our program. And so, excuse me. So I'm going to go back to here real quick. But did you cover most of this, Amy, already?
Yes, I think maybe the one point to distinguish here is with what you're doing as the liaison versus what your student organization might be doing.
Okay, sure. And so, so I'm going to jump to this real quick, and then I'm going to cover that.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm like getting caught up here, but so we did start this student organization, and as Amy pointed out earlier, one of the things that's really special about it is they kind of do find each other on campuses. And so before I knew it, the few students that I had reached out to, they all of a sudden found about 8 or 10 of themselves on campus, and they put together our first student organization at UNT that they named PUSH, which is an acronym for Persevere Until Success Happens. And really, with that student org, because we didn't have a program at the time, they started speaking in the community. They started educating child protective services workers and CASA volunteers and attorneys ad litem that represented youth in foster care. And all of a sudden we had support, the support that Amy had initially that I didn't have. And so people started to offer monetary support. I started writing grants and things like that. But having a student organization on your campus is tough. I will tell y'all. I likened it to herding cats sometimes, but I think that's true of all college students. They are going to class, they're hanging out with friends, they've got jobs, they have lives outside of, our student org. But it's really great to have a student organization that is dedicated to foster care alumni because it does kind of give them that safe place to be. And I love when they hang out when I'm not there. I think that's the best part, is that they can hang out, they can have movie night, they can share stories, they can share experiences. And those are all things that I can't necessarily relate to. And so I think having a student organization on your campus that supports specifically foster care alumni can give them a voice in a lot of ways, because they didn't necessarily have that voice while they were in foster care. And I think they do find it to be very empowering. One of the questions on here is, can or should allies participate, or should it be solely foster care alumni who are in your student org? I'll tell you that I have had a few allies, and at UNT, we have to include all students, so I can't be exclusive of anyone. So if someone wanted to be a part of the organization, they're welcome to do that. I have always found our allies to be students who are very interested in child welfare and who were incredibly supportive of their peers, knowing that their peers had had a lived experience in foster care that maybe they didn't. I found them to be very sensitive and kind, which I have always really appreciated. So I see that as a strength of student organizations that support foster care alumni. And so if you're open to that and your university requires that, it's okay to do that.
Can I jump in on that?
Absolutely.
Brenda. So yes, if you aren't currently an advisor of a student organization, we have 5 organizations we advise in our office. And the thing that I keep relearning in my 18 years here at Texas Women's is to budget more time for them. It's just an investment in the bank. When I budget time on my calendar to spend supporting student organizations, it's better for everybody. And they do take time. And I totally agree with Brenda that one of the best outcomes is when you're not needed. But to get to that point, you have to do a lot of work in the background. We are a student organization. The students themselves created the bylaws, and so they have a really broad definition of what they mean about having experienced foster care. And they've broadened it to just, not just, I shouldn't say, to other currently enrolled students who may not have parents, who might be orphaned, and that may have nothing to do with foster care at all. And to students who might have parents, but might have experienced chronic homelessness. They were not really interested in opening it to allies, but I bring that conversation up to them periodically, especially as students graduate and new ones come in, for them to decide what are they looking for, you know, what's the environment, and who are the students that they want to have be part of this group, and what's the purpose of the group too. And there's I would say kind of an ebb and a flow to that. Sometimes we'll have years where they want to do a lot of social stuff, and our 2 groups, ours is Frontiers, Brenda's is Push, where they'll do joint events, and then other years it's focused on some particular topic that they have an interest in. I would say because of our work with other student organizations, one thing that is a little bit unique to this group is that it takes longer to build trust and to build rapport. And so with my veterans group, for example, I can have a guest speaker that I think is going to be something that group is interested in, and they'll come. Whereas this group, like, they're going to have to really see, like, you know, what's going to be asked of me, you know, why am I being invited? And that's a healthy response given where they've come from. So that's why I think when you have a student organization, you need to really put the time in to support it, it can be hard. So having a second advisor is a great idea.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with that. I think having a second advisor is key for sure. And Amy's right. I think sometimes with this group, it's hard to find sometimes the charismatic leader, you know, that to be part of the group. But when you find it, it's like so golden, because one of the things that I like to do is when you find that charismatic leader, and then you find a new foster care alumni that wants to be, you know, involved, have that leader reach out directly. So it's kind of peer to peer instead of, you know, me to the student, and invite, you know, have the peer invite that student to be part of the organization. Because they just know what to say. They know what to say to be relatable. They know what to say to be welcoming. And I think the student may automatically feel more comfortable knowing that they have someone who has the same experiences as them, you know, inviting them to be part of the student organization. So it can be really special and really neat. And, you know, they oftentimes, I used to say they kind of act like family and they fight like family, and then they make up like family, you know, and so it kind of creates this family environment on campus for students who may not necessarily have a family that they can rely on, but there's definitely people who have those similar lived experiences that can relate to them on a lot of levels. You know, going back to our slide here, just it's a normalizing college activity also, right, to be in a student org. And I think, again, it can be really empowering for our foster care alumni to feel that, like, they have a seat at the table. There's a lot of pride wearing your, you know, organization t-shirt across campus, and people asking, what does that mean? You know, I've never heard of that before. And then students can very proudly talk about, hey, I was in foster care, and here's what that means, and here's what we're doing. It's really neat. And, you know, I think a question down here on the bottom is, you know, does it further isolate foster care alumni? And I have not found it to be so. I hope, and I've never heard of other student organizations that do support foster care alumni to say that, but I am always mindful of that. You know, I know that students come from a circumstance where maybe they were in foster care for a lot of years. And I don't want them to necessarily come to a college campus and feel like, oh, I'm in this extension of foster care. I want them to be as close to what we would call the traditional and normal college student and have those traditional experiences as any other student would. And so I don't necessarily want them to feel singled out, but rather I want them to feel empowered. And I think that's a really key part of student organizations, is creating an organization and a culture within that organization that makes them feel very proud of where they've come from. And a lot of students would say, I wouldn't change those experiences because they've made me who I am today. And that is really, I think, a brave and unique perspective that many of our students have that just is amazing to me because of their resiliency. It's really great.
Can I add one more thing about student organizations?
Sure.
So I think they are, of the several top leading things, point of contact, campus champions, I would put student organizations probably as number 3. I mean, it's that high up for, because it's also a visible way the institution shows you belong here. We have an organization specifically for you, and you belong here and you're not alone. And that piece is so helpful. Brenda, to your point of students finding each other, it's so helpful when you're working with prospective students. So if you have a prospective student coming to campus and they can meet someone in the organization and go to lunch, or even just maybe even have a few minutes to take a little mini tour together, that action says so much more than we could say with words, for knowing that you belong here and that you can do it.
Right, absolutely. And it just can be such a sweet experience. You know, I really enjoy the student org part. Again, it's hard, but it's also really neat. And you know, Amy mentioned earlier, just, you know, like the liaison versus the student org thing. One of the things that I think I have struggled with over the years is becoming a little overwhelmed in my role as the liaison, and as someone who's also trying to support and coordinate services for students on campus. And so you know, I think it's really important to be able to know that the liaison doesn't necessarily have to be the same person who's coordinating your foster care alumni program on your campus. Those can really be two different things, and there are two different roles there. The liaison really is working with Child Protective Services and really, you know, coordinating maybe some brokerage of resources and things like that, but having an actual program can look very different. And so I think it's important to kind of distinguish those two things. And the liaison, even though I'm the advisor for our student org, doesn't necessarily have to be the advisor for the student org. That could be someone else on campus too that just has a knowledge of foster care. You know, I have found on my campus, just through starting our organization and then growing into a program on our campus, that a lot of people will reach out to you over time and they'll say, oh, you know, even faculty or staff, and say, oh, I aged out of foster care. I want to be a part of that and I want to help. Or I'm a foster parent. How can I be involved with your group? And so we find that the more we've been around, the more resources and support are offered to us that need to be navigated. And so that can sometimes feel really overwhelming when you have a lot of support kind of coming your way, and then trying to figure out, okay, you know, people would often say, what do you need? And I would say, I don't know what I need until I need it, you know? And so there's a lot of work that comes with all of that. But the liaison doesn't necessarily have to be the person who coordinates the program, and the liaison doesn't necessarily have to be the person who's the advisor, but it is a good way to get to know your students at the same time. So this next slide here, just talking about hypothetical boundary issues. One of the things that I have discovered in working with our students, oops, sorry, y'all, I get a little too clicky here, is that it can be very difficult sometimes, and they have very unique and complicated issues that are often, what I find is they typically don't come to you until they're already in crisis. And so whether you have a student org and the students are coming to you because you're the advisor, or whether you're the liaison on campus and students are coming to you because they really need help, know that there's a lot of crisis intervention that happens as part of our role. I've put some examples on here of just things that have happened and I could name probably 50 more with students on my campus, like a student that comes to you and announces that they've quit their job again, even though they don't have another job lined up and they're not sure how they're going to eat or pay their rent. And so, that's a good time to sit down with the student and have that conversation about, you don't quit your job until you have a job, right? And so there's oftentimes there are many emergencies that come up with our students. Students that come in on a Friday afternoon and then they tell you they have no food for the weekend, and maybe your food pantry, if you have one on your campus, is already closed. That's something that you have to navigate. Maybe you have snacks in your office. We're fortunate enough to have received a gift of several thousands of dollars in gift cards that we can hand out in emergency situations. We also have an emergency fund on our campus that we can give to students if they have a situation that comes up like that. So that can be really helpful. Students that come to you and say, I'm going to be evicted in 3 days, but they haven't, they quit their job 2 weeks ago, but they're going to be evicted in 3 days. And so I often try to be preemptive and warn students, if you know that you're not going to be able to pay rent, you need to tell me as soon as possible, because it's much more likely that I'm going to be able to help you or find a resource to help you when I know things as early as possible. But be prepared that they may come to you and say, I don't have any place to go. Or, I've had students even say, well, I guess I'll just sleep in my car tonight. Oh, well, we can't do that. And so we find ourselves working hard trying to make sure that they're okay and safe and have shelter. A student may come to you and talk about roommate conflicts and wants to talk about it. And maybe that roommate happens to be another one of your foster care alumni. I've had that before. I've even had students who've graduated who hired one of their peers who are foster care alumni, and then, want to talk about conflicts that they have at work. And I'm like, oh, so you have to make sure that you're just maintaining boundaries where you can with students, because I think it would be really easy for us to want to fix everything. But a lot of times we want to empower them to figure things out on their own. We want to point them in the right direction. We want to point them towards resources, but at the same time, we want them to be able to problem solve so that they can kind of work on their own issues and problems, so that next time they'll know what to do. Okay. We definitely don't want to enable them or create situations where we're creating more dependence, but we want to make sure that we're not limiting any empowerment or any self-determination either. Another example, a student wants to go home for the weekend but doesn't have enough money, gas money, to get there. I had a student who just got a new car and they were giving everyone rides, and then they wanted an emergency gift card so they could buy gas to get home for the weekend. And I was like, oh, I'm not sure that that's an emergency. You know what I mean? And so you kind of have to navigate those relationships, because trust is thin sometimes with our students. And so sometimes these relationships can be a little bit fragile. And the tough love stuff is painful for us, because we want to be able to help and we want to be helpful, but at the same time, we have to have some boundaries with students as well. One of the things that Amy and I like to talk about is we've come a long way. And this work, especially with foster care alumni programs, with student orgs, being a liaison officer, it can be really tough. And we like to call it the illusion of order in many ways. And we say that because a lot of times things just don't occur in an orderly fashion when you're working with our students. And so, you may be asked to start a student org when you really wanted to start a program. You may be the only person on your campus who's working with foster care alumni, and it's not your primary job. Maybe like in my situation, it's one of the roles that I have at the campus, but I'm a professor and I teach classes and I have other students, but I could spend a whole lot of time working with our push students. In fact, it could definitely be a full-time job at this point. And while I have support, and I know Amy has support on her campus, and perhaps you have support on your campus as well, it can feel really overwhelming at times. And so you want to make sure that that you're utilizing that support, and that you don't have to do this all by yourself. And it took me a long time to realize that I don't have to do this all alone, and it's okay to ask for help. You may also, you're busy, you have other things. And so you may be asked to stop and write a grant or do things. And it can be really overwhelming. So, just take care of yourself, make sure you are asking for help where you need help. You're relying on your network of other foster care liaisons if you have questions or situations that come up. And for me, I had to reach out to our Division of Student Affairs because our program really did start in our Department of Social Work, kind of on the academic affairs side. And now it's this wonderful partnership between academic affairs and student affairs. And so, it takes time. All of it takes time. But just know that order will come about at some point, but at times it can be really kind of frustrating and challenging. And so I'd like to include this picture here. This is this was my first president and vice president of my student org back in 2012 when we started PUSH at UNT. Both of them are successful graduates. Both of them have master's degrees, and I couldn't be more proud. But I love the joy in their faces, and I love that I still have relationships with both of these students. They still serve on our advisory council that we have at the university. So they advise, push, and kind of help us direct and know how we can best serve foster care alumni on our campus. But anyway, I encourage you guys to continue to grow those relationships as well.
Add one quick thing when we're on this.
Absolutely.
The other thing is if you can find the time to kind of reflect over your semester and see if there's any kind of hidden gems. And what I mean by that is, yes, some of these partners are obvious, like financial aid and housing, but you might find you're able to make connections with students in ways that might not have been as obvious. So an example I want to share with you, we had a group of students that we decided we were going to try to do outdoor adventures specifically for them. And so horseback riding and camping and kayaking. And that group really bonded around that. They opened up and shared, and that wouldn't have been one of the obvious partners I would have sought. So if you can, what we learned from that is kind of looking back over this semester, what were the things that they kind of were leaning towards? Can we get a partner there that'll provide an opening for strengthening our relationship with the students and building rapport? And then the second thing I want to say about all of that is that I feel like we're beating a dead horse on this, but Education Reach really is such a partner for you. I mean, there'll be times, and there are times that happens for all of us, where not that long ago, I emailed everyone saying, I have a student who's on the waiver, but she's still enrolled, but she's going to be jointly enrolled in high school and in college. I don't know how to get the waiver going. I mean, there's so many technicalities, and that you really aren't alone. That's just the number one message. So, and resources are a perfect way to show that.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to make sure that you know other liaisons. And so that, again, the regional breakouts that we're going to have tomorrow as part of this conference is a great way to meet other people who live in your area, who you might rely on, who maybe you didn't know were also supporting students who have experienced foster care on your campus. So I encourage all of you to make sure that you attend those regional breakouts. You won't be sorry that you did, because having, feeling that you're not alone doing this work, I think is really, really important. And I know for many of you, and we didn't, because we have so many on the call, we weren't really able to talk about like where you were on your campus, but I am positive that we have people from financial aid. I'm positive we have people from advising. We may have faculty. We may have people from TRIO, amongst a lot of other areas on campus. And you might be going, oh my gosh, I have no experience with this. I have no experience working with youth who have experienced foster care. And so we definitely want to make sure that as Amy said, you're not alone in this at all. And it's our goal to be supportive. And so here are some helpful resources on this slide, and I know there've been some questions in the chat about, will y'all share the PowerPoint? We will, we're happy to share it. We'll ask to put it on our Education Reach for Texans website. That will be a great place for everyone to be able to access it. But you will see on this PowerPoint that there are links to our website. Also on our website, you'll be able to find that liaison manual, the little pictures on the very first slide. That manual was put together by a very robust committee of people who are stakeholders within higher ed and the Children's Commission. It was put together by higher ed liaisons. It was put together by foster care alumni. And so it's really a helpful guide to kind of one-stop shop to tell you where to look and to give you some basic information if you're new to this. The Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board is the place that keeps the list for foster care liaisons and should update those. And I know we had a question in the chat earlier about, if I'm not on the list, and Amy, mentioned not being on the list and having some issues with that as well at one point. So the coordinating board is who keeps that. But I would say if you are the liaison, one of the things that you're supposed to do is you're supposed to have a presence on your university or college website. So make sure that that's easy to find, that, if someone Googled foster care liaison for UNT, I would hope I would pop up, or I would hope that my program would pop up and that you would be able to easily find me there. The Texas Youth Commission is also a great site to learn more about just different benefits that youth are eligible for and how to connect them with those resources and benefits if you're not familiar with it. There's the handbook there. Transitional living services, and the DFPS website, you guys, has so much information on it. I could probably spend like 3 days just reading through that, but it really is a very important resource for you. So definitely take note of the transitional living services, and that link there provides a ton of information. And Casey Family Programs, again, provides that kind of framework that Amy discussed, that supporting success. I follow that framework at UNT as well. I'm also a firm believer in not reinventing the wheel. If something works, by golly, use it and borrow it. And so that's exactly what Casey Family Programs has provided all of us. It's a great framework. It makes sense on your campuses. It's easy to follow, and I recommend that everyone use that. And then here's our benefits section. Do you want to take another break, Amy, at this point?
I think that's a great idea. This is a natural break point.
All right. Why don't we come back at, let's say, 3:05. So that gives you 8 minutes. Okay, 8 minutes to run to the restroom, get a drink, stretch, do some jumping jacks, kind of get awake again. And then we will talk about some of the benefits that our students may be eligible for. And we'll see you back here in about 8 minutes at 3:05.
I'll be right back, Brenda.
Okay. And I just want to say, if anybody does stick around and you have any questions, I mean, I would be happy to try to answer any of those during the break and in the interim if you have anything that's burning.
Ask a quick question.
Sure, go ahead.
So I've gone to the Reach for Texas site and the page where it says foster care liaison list. I've clicked on it a few times. It just takes me to another site that still doesn't have the list, that just has other information. How do you find it on there?
Well, you know what? It's funny that you mentioned that because we had a board meeting this morning and a board member pointed that out. And so that is something that I promise we will fix. But what you can do instead of going there is Google College for All Texans. And that's the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board site. And you can navigate through there and there should be a link to a liaison list on that.
Okay, so when you click on the link on y'all's page, it takes you to College for All Texans, and I can find nowhere on there to find the liaison list. Where's it hidden on their page?
It's like the last paragraph. Scroll to the bottom of that page. Last time I looked, that's where it was. It's buried. Yeah, it's on that first page at the bottom.
Oh my God! Like, so when I go to the bottom, it has a 60 times 30, and then the Gen Tex information and apply for Texas.
Okay, let me look.
Yeah, I'm gonna hunt it down too because now I'm curious.
Yeah,
I've been sitting here while y'all been talking like for 15 minutes trying to go this to this to this, and since we have a lot of colleges in the area, but I'm the public school one, I would like to know those people, but I can't find it.
So we have, I think Brenda already was mentioning this. So one of our founding board members has been helping me because mine personally wasn't right either, even though I've been the liaison for years and years and years. And there are all these links out there. And so it's something that we don't own these lists, but we're trying to advocate for cleaning them up and getting it down to a single list that's easier to find. Sometimes I just Google foster care liaison Texas.
Yeah, and I just found you guys like on that College for All Texans website, there's that little search bar up at the top. If you just type in foster care liaisons, it will take you to the page where the list of designated liaisons is. It's about halfway down under eligible institutions. And the liaison list is there.
But you are raising a really important issue.
It's really hard to find.
It is. And we should be easy to find, right? But, one of the things that House Bill 1702 did state was that we need to make sure that that we are available on websites, right, at our universities, our colleges, so that students can readily find us.
I even tried on our local college's website and I couldn't find it. But
really, yeah, and I'm not saying that everyone's in compliance with that, but they should be.
Well, it's a complicated website, so
yeah.
I was able to find it and I put it in the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So I've had the experience of being able to get the list from one department, from financial aid, but not from admissions because we're switching our database and they didn't have it at their fingertips. And I think it's appropriate to remind people of legislation. And I couldn't remember the bill number. I emailed Brenda what's the bill number again? Not that we're trying to make anybody work harder, but there was a reason this legislation was passed. And so sometimes that helps a little bit to share the bill, not in a heavy-handed sort of way, but I'm not just asking for this because I'm trying to give you something extra to do. I need this list so I can serve these students. And then Barb, your comment, I see that Brenda answered about referrals from high school. I sometimes get those. We have a designated admissions counselor. So if it gets to her, then it gets to me, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's 100%.
Good questions.
Now, there's been some communication in the chat about McKinney-Bento, and we've not really connected with that around this work. I think if the homeless liaison legislation might have passed, that might have changed some things.
Right. All right. Do we want to get started again, Amy?
Sounds great.
Okay. So welcome back, everyone. And I know a few people are still going to get to their seats here in a few minutes to resume. And then we definitely want to save some time just for some question and answers, whether that's, understanding your liaison role and what that looks like for you specifically, student orgs, campus programs. We want to be able to answer all of your questions regarding those things. Because those things can be similar, but yet very different. But one of the things that we have found that can be, I think, the most confusing and overwhelming as a liaison is just understanding benefits. And Amy and I are, we dabble in this, we'll say, and I like to say we also know enough to be dangerous, but we want to introduce some of this to you all so that you at least have an idea of what's out there. There are actually a lot of different benefits and services and resources for our foster care alumni that you may not be aware of, and they may not be aware of it either. And so it's important to at least know where to look for these benefits and resources so that you can kind of help guide them. So I want to talk real quickly about preparation for adult living, or what we call PAL. And so PAL, and we have different slides as we go through here, but PAL is going to be a really, really important resource that's available to your youth who have aged out of foster care. Usually students don't take these PAL courses until they are around 15 and a half to 16 years old. I think you're starting to allow youth to take them earlier, but youth have to take these PAL classes in order to qualify for certain benefits if they age out of foster care. So there are also workers that we call PAL workers, and they are caseworkers who stay with youth who have aged out of foster care, and they are a wonderful resource. They're like my lifeline to CPS at this point. So when I have a student who is aged out of care and they need help with something, they need a resource, need help navigating a benefit, they need an extra copy of their Texas tuition and fee waiver letter, it's the PAL worker who I rely on. So it's really important to remember that acronym, Preparation for Adult Living, and know that there are PAL caseworkers out there that even though your student is no longer in foster care, they can still have this voluntary connection to this PAL worker who can help connect them to many, many resources available to them. Of course, there's the Texas tuition and fee waiver letter that you all are probably familiar with. Texas is one of those, one of 22 states in the United States that provides a tuition and fee waiver for youth who have been in foster care. Not everyone who has experienced foster care will be eligible for that waiver. So again, going back to the financial aid analogy, a different package for everyone. But this is a really important asset for students. I have students that have come to me and they didn't realize they actually qualified for the waiver. And so again, that PAL worker is kind of my lifeline. And so I will contact a PAL worker or maybe even an adoption worker with CPS, provide information on the student, like their name, their date of birth, and they can look the student up in their system. It's called Impact. They can look them up and find out whether or not they qualify for that tuition and fee waiver, and then they can send us that letter directly to the student. I always tell the student to keep extra copies because sometimes you have to resubmit those to financial aid or student financial services. And so that's a really important thing that they need to have in their important file, along with their like birth certificate and social security card, because this tuition and fee waiver is a lifetime benefit for youth who have experienced foster care. So they could get their bachelor's degree, they could get 3 master's degrees and 8 PhDs if they wanted to. And this tuition and fee waiver will still be good as long as the legislature funds it, which so far so good. So we'll hope that that stays intact.
Brenda, can I share something really quickly on that?
Absolutely.
So during the pandemic, working in and out of the office, my very most favorite experience that's happened during this time, a student had emailed, I really need to meet with you. So I came to campus to meet with her. And she said, I've got 2 more semesters to go, but I'm turning 26, so my waiver is going to expire. So she understood it backwards. And when I shared with her, no, because you've activated before before your 26th birthday, you have it for life. I mean, it was like she won the lottery. We were jumping up and down. She was so excited. So we're just really fortunate in Texas to have this benefit for students who qualify.
For sure. And I want to add to that in this last legislative session, Jarvis Johnson out of Houston actually presented a bill, House Bill 700, and it has passed both the House and the Senate. And what it will do is when youth in foster care take this preparation for adult living course that I mentioned earlier, it can actually now count as dual credit. And in order to pay for that, what it will do is it will activate that tuition and fee waiver for youth, because once it's activated, as Amy said, it's this lifetime benefit. But if youth don't activate it in time, then they don't get to use it. And that would be a tragedy, right? And so House Bill 700, Jarvis Johnson, out of Houston, PAL now can count as a dual credit course and activate that tuition and fee waiver, which is really cool. The third bullet there is ETV. We're going to talk about that. The PAL Transitional Living Allowance. I think we have slides for all of these, so I'm going to kind of bump through here, and we can kind of go back and forth, Amy, if you want to, do that. I'll start with the PAL. We kind of talked about this already, but it does provide that aftercare case management with that PAL caseworker. If a youth has taken those PAL courses, they also qualify for aftercare room and board, which is some really helpful resources that's intended to kind of get them set up in maybe an apartment, help pay an apartment deposit, maybe help pay first month's rent, maybe help furnish an apartment or get them pots, pans, things that they need to live. And so that's really helpful. And then youth who have completed PAL also qualify for what's called a transitional living allowance. This is dispersed to them in 2 separate $500 checks. It's dispersed directly to the youth, and they can use that again for any type of living expenses, transportation, educational expenses, things like that as they see fit. But it's only $1,000, and we know that that doesn't go very far. But it's between the transitional living allowance and the aftercare room and board, it's intended to kind of help them as they're leaving foster care and moving on towards independence. Of course, PAL is attached to that tuition fee waiver letter. If you don't know how to get a hold of that, ask the student who is their PAL worker. If they don't know who their PAL worker is, I know Amy or I would be more than happy to help connect you with the PAL worker in your region. Again, I can't emphasize enough that DFPS website. You can also just Google DFPS PAL, and you will be able to find who the PAL supervisor is in your region, and they can help you get that tuition and fee waiver for your student. They also help with the education and training voucher. They can help a youth apply for that. Youth have Medicaid. So our young adults who are coming to our campuses actually qualify for Medicaid because they've been in foster care. I would emphasize to them to make sure they don't let that Medicaid lapse. They have to renew it every year, renew their eligibility. And I had a student one time who did let it lapse, and she was pregnant and she desperately needed medical care. And we literally were on the phone for 4 hours trying to get her Medicaid back. And so make sure that your students are updating their most recent mailing address, because they will send the renewal notice to their permanent mailing address. And for a lot of our students, there really isn't one. So they need to make sure it's like a PO box on campus or a trusted adult in their life where they can have that information sent to. And then former foster care youth and higher ed healthcare program is another extension that provides them some healthcare services, and they are eligible until they're 26, just like our kids would be if they were on our insurance. These students are eligible for Medicaid until they're 26 as well.
Okay, I'll jump in on this one if you'd like, Brenda.
Please.
So like I just said, 26, it's really the 25th birthday for tuition fee. She was turning 26. That's what she was worried about. And I'm glad that I shared that oopsies with you, because this is a lot of information. That very first slide of this section that Brenda showed you, think of that as a table of contents. And we have a slide to briefly describe every benefit that follows after. If any of you only are a liaison, I shouldn't say only, if you are the lucky one that this is all you do every day, I would love to see your name in the chat, because I suspect there's no one in this that's your role. And so it's just a lot of information to remember. So we are very cautious when we talk to students about benefits, especially since we are not the agency to give the benefits. And so that's why I shared that link with you from DPFS. I love this particular page because it says, do I qualify? And it tells students exactly who to contact if they're trying to figure out if they qualify or not. I don't put myself in the position of determining that, since that's not what the university, yes, you will have access to this PowerPoint. I see someone asking. So, you know, same thing with other groups. Like I mentioned earlier, I work with veterans. I don't speak to them about the details of their benefits for the same reason. It's too detailed. There's so much to know. It changes all the time. But the bottom line on the tuition and fee waiver is that, I mean, this is the golden ticket. It will waive all of their tuition and most of their fees, not all of their fees. The student has to get this, the letter submitted to the registrar's office on most colleges and universities. And then that's where the waiver then goes through, but it's not every single fee, and it does not include housing, meal plans, books. All of those are expensive, you know, whatever kind of living, cost of living sorts of things they want to cover won't be covered by this. It really covers their tuition and the majority of their fees.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk a little bit about ETV. This has changed dramatically due to COVID. And so the information I'm giving you is correct right now. And I would say if you ever have the opportunity to go to a training that is done by Brandy Purswell, who's with Baptist Child and Family Services out of San Antonio, that is kind of the party that oversees the education and training voucher in Texas. And so ETV is a federally funded state administered program specifically for youth who were in foster care. It's needs-based, and the youth, our students, must meet satisfactory academic progress in order to be eligible to receive ETV. They also have to complete the FAFSA because it's a grant, and it's a federally funded grant. And so so they have to show that they have a need. They have to fill out an application each semester. So they'll fill it out for the fall, they'll fill it out for the spring, they fill it out for the summer. And so traditionally, this ETV money has provided up to $5,000 for our students per academic year for those who are eligible. And so if you have a student on your campus who's been adopted, they're not going to be eligible for ETV. If you have a student who aged out of foster care, they're definitely going to be eligible. And then again, going back to our analogy, it's different for every student. And so depending on when a student was in foster care, how long, how old they were when they entered foster care, all of those things will determine whether or not they're actually eligible for ETV. What you need to know, though, is enough to ask and then try to find out for each individual student. Just know that ETV exists, and then you need to figure out if your student is going to be eligible for it. And again, Baptist Child and Family Services, you can Google them, or ETV Texas. Their website is full of really wonderful information about ETV, and their staff is extremely helpful in helping you determine whether or not your student might be eligible. I have the asterisk on there when it says provide up to $5,000, and that's because currently with COVID relief, they have changed the amount of ETV that our students are eligible for. So currently, they are now eligible for up to $12,000 in ETV. This is money they don't have to pay back. It can pay those additional fees that Amy was talking about that the waiver may not cover. It can pay for housing. It can pay for dining. It can pay for books, utilities, transportation. If they need oil changes, they can get their oil changed on their car if they need new tires, as well as clothing, computers, you know, technology that they might need, school supplies. And so ETV is this really wonderful pot of money for our students that many of them are eligible for.
I have a question.
Oh, yes. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Norma.
this is Norma Davila from Region 8 at Texas A&M's San Antonio. I'm the foster care support coordinator. And ETV, I do have 2 adopted youth that did qualify for ETV. It depends on when they were adopted.
Okay, like the age they were, perhaps.
Yes, what age they were when they were adopted. So I have 2 adopted youth that are receiving ETV right now.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. And I'm guessing that those youth must have been adopted much older.
Yes, at 16, 17, somewhere around there. Yes.
Yeah, so much older. Okay, thank
Yes.
you, Norma. I really
You're welcome.
appreciate you pointing that out. Yeah, and so lots of rules, clearly, and you just want to make sure that you are able to kind of do some research and figure out whether or not your student is eligible. But I really appreciate that information. that's helpful
Yeah,
for.
it took me asking a lot of questions from Brandy.
Yeah, Brandy's so great, isn't she? I just love
Yeah.
her. Yeah.
Brenda, I have a question also.
Yes, Frankie.
So if I had a child that was adopted by grandparents and then she came back into care and aged out, would she be eligible for these funds?
Probably. You know, again, everything is case by case, but I would think that if she was adopted but then came back into care, that CPS probably again took temporary or permanent managing conservatorship of her. And if she aged out, then I would believe that that would make her eligible. You'd want to verify that, but I would probably bet money on it that she would be.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. So the amount of ETV that a student is eligible to receive is based on the cost of attendance at your school. So it's similar to other financial aid. And so students can only receive up to the cost of attendance, as we know. And so if they are covered by Pell Grant or scholarships, you know, the tuition fee waiver, they may not qualify for the whole $5,000, or they may not qualify for now the full $12,000. And so be aware of that. With the COVID changes, youth in foster care, other eligible youth and young adults ages 16, it is now up to 27 that they may receive this money. And that's a huge difference. One of the things that didn't change with COVID relief, however, is that they can only receive this pot of money for a total of 15 semesters. And so it's not like the tuition and fee waiver that just goes on and on and on. There is a period of time that they have to be able to use this benefit, or they are no longer eligible for it. And again, they have to submit the FAFSA when applying for ETV, or they won't receive it, because it's kind of like Pell Grant. It's, you know, financial aid essentially.
Can I add a comment to that? So if you've not worked a lot with financial aid, I know we're throwing out a lot of terms that can feel super overwhelming. And this is why it's really great to have a champion in financial aid, because yes, cost of attendance does limit the amount of aid and grants they're allowed to receive. And yes, it would be great not to have a loan and have grants and aid instead. But everyone's situation is unique. You can do budget reviews to adjust your cost of attendance so that you may be able to accept a larger award depending on what your situation is. And also when their circumstances change, if they have a baby, if their work situation changes, all those things might help. So we've got a lot of good information here in the chat. And I think how this conversation is happening right now is exactly what we wanted people to have the experience of, which is, the resources are there. You just have to get in touch with the people. Brandy actually would be willing to meet with you virtually. She'll do webinars for your students to help them apply. You just have to advertise it.
Right. And I want to also add, Amy, before you move on, that Evelyn noted that if students take out loans and their college cost is covered, they won't get ETV. That is absolutely correct. And so we also encourage youths not to take out loans. They definitely need to be using ETV, Pell Grant, those things that they don't have to pay back first. And we need to, I see part of our role is kind of educating them on that, making sure that they're not taking out loans. And I often find that youth are terrified of taking out loans. And I don't blame them for that. It's a lot of, I shouldn't say youth, but our young people who are our students. I mean, they really worry about how am I ever going to pay that back, because they just can't see how they'll ever pay back thousands of dollars. And so I would definitely encourage them to make sure they're using up all those grant resources, Pell, ETV, before they accept loans.
Right. And once you accept the loan, you can also you don't have to, yeah. But all this also points to getting, and this is the really hard part, getting them to apply early, apply for financial aid early, apply for these benefits early, so that there's time to prioritize and sort what you're going to receive and where you're going to have gaps.
All right. Do you want to cover this one, Amy?
I don't have, I'm not that familiar with this one, actually.
Okay, so let's see here. So PAL and the transitional living allowance. So I'll cover it. I'm happy to talk about it. So again, youth usually start taking PAL courses at about 15 and a half. And again, those can count as dual credit now, thanks to House Bill 700. They have to be in an independent living situation in order to get this transitional living allowance, or supervised or semi-supervised setting. And so this is typically for those youth who age out of foster care. They must be in a paid placement 24 months prior to requesting. So what that means is they're in foster care for 24 months prior to asking for this transitional living allowance. They must be enrolled in attending school. They must be employed or actively seeking employment, or they must be attending some type of a vocational program as well in order to be eligible for this pot of money. And again, they may receive up to $1,000, and it's kind of divvied out to them in two $500 increments. And so I have seen a few students who have used this, but honestly not a lot, or if they've used it, I wasn't necessarily aware of it, but I'm sure they're using it.
Right.
You want to talk about SIL?
Yeah, I love SIL. So just as Brenda had described earlier, supervised independent living is an opportunity for a student who wants to choose to stay in extended care, and as a result, they get the continuing support, and then they get their food and housing covered. So people might think, well, why would a student ever say no to that? And I think the thing is to put yourself back in high school when you were tired of everybody telling you what to do, and especially if you had the experience of not having much autonomy or agency in your life, where you felt like you weren't able to make decisions for you. They were made on, you weren't making in those decisions, they were made for you. And so sometimes talking about staying in care might be a tough sell for an adolescent who's not had a good experience. But when we have an opportunity, and that's where, again, it's great if you're working with your admissions department and you're working with students who are prospective, to share with them, have you thought about SIL to see if you're eligible? And when you kind of explain the benefits, I think one thing that students really need to hear is that no one at the university knows who is receiving SIL support. I know students have shared with me, well, I don't want people to think I'm in foster care in college. I want to live in the dorms like everybody else. And you know what? We have students who are here receiving SIL, and I don't even know who they are. I only know the ones that identify, because this piece of information will not be shared with a liaison. This is up to the student to share, at least depending on your model. We're with a third party, like Brenda was mentioning, they're with a third party, so we don't do the direct case management. And so I'm only involved if the student decides to share that with me, or if it's a prospective student who's thinking about it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have any way of knowing. And I think it's really important for students to know that they're going to have a very normal experience. They just don't have to come up with all the other money. So I just have nothing but positive things to say about it. So you need to find out if your university or college is a designated site. What it really requires is your housing department to get into a contract with the agency that provides it. And sometimes that means the payment's a little atypical in terms of timing and that sort of things. An earlier question about what does the waiver cover? Well, one of the things the waiver does not cover is the housing application fee. And so when you're working with housing, you can get them to apply that to the bill, and then these other sources will cover that expense, as an example.
Right. And I would also add that, if a student does have like an application fee or a deposit that needs to be paid, they can also contact their PAL worker or their aftercare case manager. And there are often pots of money out there that can help pay for those things for students, as well as, like bedding and dorm supplies and things like that. So there's always a way to get those resources for students if they don't have those things.
Right.
PAL worker can really help with those.
Absolutely. The one fee, though, that they should never pay if they're on the waiver, that is the college application fee. So the fee to apply to the university, that is included under the waiver. So it's important that your admissions office knows that.
All right. So extended foster care, let's talk about that. This kind of goes along with that SIL program. And any chance I get, when I have a youth that, a lot of times when they turn 18, they are ready to get out of care for various reasons. Maybe they haven't had a positive experience in foster care. Maybe they are ready to adult, as many kids are when they turn 18 or they graduate from high school and they think, oh, I've got this, I can handle it. But, adulting is hard, as we all know. And so when I do have a youth who is willing to stay in extended foster care, I really try to encourage them to do that, because they're just eligible for so much more support that can help them be successful as they pursue, the higher education. So extended foster care is this voluntary program that offers youth who are 18 to 22 years old opportunities to continue their foster care placement and to facilitate their transition to independence. CPS still supervises them. They still provide case management, but it's not very invasive. And I think that's one of the things that students are sometimes fearful of, or youth who are aging out are a little bit fearful of, is they don't want someone hawking over them. And that's really not the case. I mean, they're allowed to live independently. They get to move to campus. They live like every other college student. The difference is they get visited by someone periodically. And the same is true for SIL. They're going to have a case manager who, I know our case managers come to campus and they help me actually. They help me help students navigate, financial aid or different issues that they're having. And we make up a team that really supports the students. And I love that. To qualify for extended foster care, a young adult has to be in CPS conservatorship the day before his or her 18th birthday. And so the criteria, they have to be 18 to 22 years old. They have to be regularly attending high school or enrolled in a program leading towards a high school diploma or a GED. They have to regularly attend an institution of higher education or post-secondary vocational or technical program. And they have to have a minimum of 6 hours per semester. And so they have to be making progress towards something. So that's really important. They actively participate in a program or activity that promotes or removes barriers to employment. So something maybe through the Texas Workforce Commission, which is a wonderful resource for our foster care alumni that's probably underutilized. And so Jen, thank you for the information you put in the chat. They have to be employed for at least 80 hours per month, or they have to be incapable of doing any of those because of a documented medical condition, or they might be receiving SSI for a documented medical condition or disability that they have. And so if you have a student who is on your campus in extended foster care, chances are they're going to be probably working a little bit, and chances are they're going to be obviously enrolled in courses on your campus.
Yeah, I want to make a comment slightly off topic about working on campus. So when possible, we encourage students to work on campus. Not an excessive number of hours, that's a problem, but there's research that shows that students that at both ends of the spectrums, and this is all college students, not just students who've experienced foster care, students who have too much free time and students who are overly extended, both end up not doing as well academically. So having students find that magic mix of like having enough to stay busy, but not so much they're overwhelmed, is really does seem to be, there's a relationship between that and academic success. And when they work on campus, we know they're also more engaged with the institution. So anything we can do to encourage these students especially to work on campus, I think is a great idea. So on Medicaid, the main thing I want to say about Medicaid, Brenda already discussed it a little bit earlier, and the importance of staying on top of those deadlines. Two things. One is, I'm sure this is not a newsflash to anybody, but there's a shortage of providers that accept Medicaid. And so that can be a challenge. See if you can work, if you have a health clinic on your campus, see if you can work an arrangement where they will find funding to help with these students. The second thing I want to talk about related to this is SNAP. So it's very likely that students who have experienced foster care, especially if they're eligible for Medicaid, they are going to be eligible for SNAP. And the stigma around SNAP, which if you're not familiar with it, basically it used to what used to be called food stamps. That stigma has really, I think in so many ways, it's not as, I don't think students see it as problematic now that there's a much greater understanding of food insecurity among all college students. And so connecting them to other federal benefits like SNAP, where they can get some help with food, is just, it's a great thing for these students, even though that wasn't on the slide. Throw it in there as a little bonus. And also the access for college students is definitely easier than it used to be under new rules. So.
Right. All right. We had another question about whether or not we'll share the presentation. We will definitely share that, you all, and we'll put it on our Education Reach for Texans website so that you all can access it there. All right. Pell Grants and scholarships. I will tell you that the majority of my students who have aged out of foster care qualify for Pell Grant, and often full Pell Grant, which is great news. Of course, they have ETV as well. I also like to point out that there are some other scholarships that are offered through the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, including this Freshman Success Fund for foster youth, which each year there will be 4 one-time $1,000 grants. You know, when it comes down to it, there are a lot of students in Texas, and that's not a lot of them. And so it's obviously competitive. And then there's the Ed Davis PAL Scholarship, which is for $1,000 per academic year, and they're available to sophomore, junior, and senior students as well. And it's again very specific for those who are majoring in government, political science, history. I believe Ed Davis was an attorney. And so he gave the scholarship and gives it annually. But I want to point out another really wonderful resource that I know Amy's students and my students have also been able to take advantage of. It's called the International Student Foundation, ISF. You can Google that, and students who are accepted into this program, actually, they get scholarship money, they get mentorship. In the past, they've offered study abroad opportunities, and the scholarship actually increases over time. It's a wonderful program, and I know they interact with us at UNT, they interact with Amy. We have a number of students who've been able to take advantage of that International Student Foundation Scholarship, ISF. And so I would encourage everyone to also let their students be aware of that particular opportunity. All right. Whew, I'm going to stop the slides there so I can actually see your faces now, because I haven't been able to see them like for the last 3 hours, but it's so good to see everyone. Amy and I would like to open it up to any questions that anyone has, or conversations, maybe resources that you're aware of that you want to share with the group also. Now would be a great time to do that. I know we've kind of worn y'all out.
I actually do have a question. I'm Tricia from Tarrant County College. Did I understand correctly that if a student or if a foster care child is adopted out of foster care, they are not eligible for these? Did I misunderstand that?
Not eligible for what? I'm sorry, Tricia.
For the FCAT benefits.
The ETV?
Any of it?
If they're adopted?
Yes.
They may qualify for the tuition and fee waiver, and not all adopted students, however, will qualify for that. That is something that is kind of negotiated with the adoptive parents at the time of adoption. My understanding is that it's need-based, or just part of that negotiation for adoption subsidy. So I can give a personal example. My brother was a foster adoptive parent, and he adopted 3 children out of the Texas CPS foster care system. They're number 7, 8, and 9 from their birth mother. The 7th child is a Caucasian child, and he was adopted on his first birthday, and he was not eligible for the tuition and fee waiver, so he doesn't have it. However, his brother and sister, who are number 8 and 9 from the same birth mother, are biracial, and they were adopted after their 2nd birthday because there was a birth father, and it became a complicated kind of legal case to terminate. And so they were adopted after their 2nd birthday, and they're also minority children. And so they qualify for the tuition and fee waiver and subsidy, whereas his oldest child did not. And so again, going back to that foster care analogy, it really just depends. And so some of your adopted students will qualify and some will not. We actually have a lot of adopted students on our campus who qualify for the tuition and fee waiver. Amy, have you had?
I was going to add to that too, that we have a lot that are adopted that qualify. And something else that I think is a helpful perspective when working with students, whether they were adopted or not, is not to make the assumption that one is a good experience and one is a bad experience.
Right.
We don't have any way of knowing that. Some students actually have incredibly beautiful relationships with their foster families and consider those their forever families. And so to judge that that was a bad experience or lacking in some way would be highly offensive and hurtful. Same thing with someone who was adopted, to assume, oh, that was all unicorns and rainbows. might be making a really inaccurate presumption. And that's why it's so important to get to know the student as an individual and not make those assumptions. And your question is a good question. It just points to how complex these benefits are, because we just went through those fairly quickly. They're all different. If you qualify for one, it doesn't mean you might also qualify for all of them necessarily. So that's why it's good to have, I mean, I don't ever tell a student, yes, you qualify. I always go to the source because I just don't want to misspeak on that. And I don't feel like I know it enough.
Yeah, you can go to the DFPS website, Adoption Services, and refer them to their adoption services person based on their last name. And they have that list of contacts on the DFPS website, Adoption Services. So that I agree with you, Amy. I don't tell anyone they don't qualify, that I say, let's call the number. You were adopted at a certain age. Let's call the number and find out. And I have found out that several of my students qualify for the waiver and the student did not realize it.
No, that's the greatest. I mean, it's disappointing if it's when they're a senior.
Yes, exactly. And actually that's happened to me. I've been here just 2 years, and that my first 3 months here at A&M San Antonio, a young person came to me looking for scholarships, and same thing, didn't realize they were adopted and were told they didn't qualify for ETV. And then I found out that they did, and they only were able to use it one semester because then they turned the age limit. So yeah, that's unfortunate. So if they're adopted, they qualify for ETV if they were adopted after the age of 16 and they have not turned 27. So that's on the ETV website.
Thank you,
So
Norma.
I have a little bit of information. I'm a foster parent for the last 8 years in Texas, so I've had a lot of kiddos throughout the situation, but they started the adoption waiver for adopted kids back in 2009. So as long as you were adopted on or after September 1st, 2009, any adopted child qualifies for that waiver. They might not qualify for the subsidy or for the Medicaid benefits or things like that, depending on their situation, but all after September 1st, 2009 do get the waiver for school.
Thank you, Susan.
Good
And
to know.
yeah, going to that DFPS website and studying that, I think is priceless, right? Is that the key here, is really
Yes.
earning those benefits. And they feel like they change, because clearly they do over time, but that probably is your best resource, you all, is going directly to the DFPS website to get information about those benefits, for sure. Thank you, Susan. Do you work for CASA of Denton County by any chance?
I do not. I am just foster parent.
Okay.
So,
Your
well,
office could be
recently adopted 2 of them out of our 19 that we've had. So yay.
Congratulations. That's wonderful. Glad you're here today. I want to say too, even amongst siblings, they could have different circumstances, so that's important to know as well. Don't assume that their benefits are going to be the same, because they may not be the same. Any other questions you guys might have? I think y'all might be tired at this point. I know, information overload, that's for real when it comes to this type of work. So just know you don't have to know it all, that there are various resources. Reach out to people for help, ask lots of questions. Just know you don't have to do this alone. And, we just want to thank you all for being present today. We want to thank you for your service to youth in our community, to our students who are on our campuses. I often say it takes the university and community village to really make sure that these students get where they're going, and they're all worth every bit of it. And there will be good days and there will be not so good days, but just know that when they graduate and they have jobs and things like that, that your efforts were never in vain. Sometimes it just takes students longer. I've had a number of students who have been in their late 20s, early 30s. And I love that. They've struggled for a long time, and then they finally kind of went, I need to do something. And they come back to school, and they're on our campuses. So it's really wonderful, no matter what their age is, to support them, help them through this process, and make sure that they achieve a college education. You know, make sure the cycle of abuse and neglect and substance abuse doesn't repeat itself. And I think our campuses are really key in doing that.
I'm going to put a quick plug in, or a teaser, depending on how you look at it, about tomorrow. So we're super excited about our keynotes tomorrow. So Alexis and Justin Black were both in foster care in Michigan, and they met in college, and they've written a book. I don't know if you've all have seen the bio yet of what they're talking about tomorrow, but all I'm going to say is that I think you're going to leave the keynote feeling inspired and also validated for how important your work is.
And I want to
I
add.
have a question really quickly.
Oh, go ahead.
If you don't mind, since Amy brought up Michigan, a student from Florida, is there any case in which a student who's not in the state of Texas can have benefits transferred to Texas?
Can have benefits transferred to Texas. I have heard this, Christy, that sometimes adoptive parents move away, and then they're like, can my kid use their benefit here in Oklahoma? And the answer is no. Like the tuition and fee waiver, they have to come back to Texas to school to use their tuition and fee waiver.
Okay.
And they had to be in care in Texas, because I have the opposite happen, where people were in care somewhere else and then they come to Texas. So I was just helping actually a doctoral student who was in foster care in the 80s. But what has turned out is she's eligible for some other of our emergency aid designated for vulnerable populations, even though she doesn't get the waiver. I've kind of wondered with online how that might work. But it would have to be, they would have to have been in care in Texas, and then the institution would have to be a Texas institution. They were living somewhere else. I don't know. Good question.
Yeah, it really was. And we definitely serve students who weren't in foster care in Texas, but they self-identify as having experienced foster care. And, we serve them just like we would anyone else. It's just they may not have all the benefits. So we may have to help them broker more resources, to make sure that their needs are met. Great questions.
Is there, and this might be a dumb question, but is there a like a listserv for foster care liaisons that we can go to and reach out to each other for advice or information?
It's a really good question. I know Education Reach for Texans has a listserv, so we send out periodic newsletters and resources and things like that. But Amy, are you aware of like an actual listserv that someone manages where questions and answers can?
No, I mean, I think that's a great question. I was just searching for the link for the survey, because that's exactly the kind of thing to put in the survey, is if you feel like that would be valuable, having a list. We had one a long time ago, and you know how listservs, if no one's really putting any posting and people aren't replying, they just kind of die on the vine. That's what happened, and we couldn't think of any way to kind of get it going again, but I would definitely open to ideas. And then for those of you who might be in student affairs, if you're a member of NASPA, which is the one of the national organizations for student affairs professionals, there is a knowledge community that is based on serving students who've experienced foster care, and that knowledge community does have a listserv, but that's a pretty specific audience. You have to be a member, and blah blah blah. So I'm going to post this survey link again, and if you're a liaison, we would love for you to complete this, and that would be the kind of feedback to give. We'll also have an opportunity tomorrow at the end of the conference to just give feedback in general. So if you want to also just post it in the chat tomorrow, that I think a statewide liaison list would be helpful, or maybe even quarterly webinars where people can just share ideas and check in. I mean, whatever your ideas are, we're very open to how can we support liaisons across the state.
I do have one more question. What about, I guess, to all the other foster care liaisons, has anybody ever created an intake form? I know, I'm sorry, earlier I had to leave, and so I just had y'all in my car listening to y'all while I was picking up my kid. But I heard y'all talking about questions that we should ask, students who have been in foster care. does anybody have like an intake form that they've created, like kind of things to check off of what you should ask, and did you check that off, or what resources would go to that, or something kind of almost like a guide, I guess. I know I work with disability services as well. And so we have an intake form for that. And that's really helpful to just kind of keep on the same track and make sure that we're asking all the right questions.
I can respond to that. I think that's a super great idea. I love that idea. And we have played around with a couple. Austin Community College actually has a really great intake form, because the other thing they do is triage, because some of these students have their situations and their needs are super complex. And so not every single student needs a check-in monthly. Some need them weekly. It just sort of depends. So we have an appointment request form, and that's how we, and then we put that in a spreadsheet so that we can just keep track for ourselves. But I know that in Michigan, they have a coaching model that has kind of an intake form specific to this population. We just don't have or we haven't up until now, had the ability to focus our intakes on specific groups. So we have and we don't call it an intake, we call it an appointment request. So any of other groups of students that we work with can complete that.
Okay.
I don't know if that's helpful. I mean, we can share that with you if you want to put your email in the chat.
Sure, definitely. I think any help is helpful.
On top of that, I want to add just a quick statement about working with our foster care alumni. One of the things that is so true about them is that trust kind of comes slowly, and trust is built, and relationships and connections can be really tough for them. And so I would just say, have an open door, let them come in and talk to you and have those conversations. One of the things I'm really careful about is I don't ask them specific questions about their circumstance or their experience in foster care. If anything, I may ask them, did you age out or were you adopted? Because that helps kind of guide what resources that might be available to them. So I kind of see that as a fair question. But over time, students will share more and more with you and reveal more and more with you. And sometimes it's really difficult stuff to hear and to see sometimes, but when they trust you enough to share that, that's a pretty special place to be. And it's also a privilege and an awesome responsibility at the same time. And so I would just say, again, going on that trauma-informed model, be really sensitive to the experiences of these students. Be careful what you ask them. I think I teach social work. So one of the things I talk about is, as a social worker, we're naturally nosy. That's what I try to tell students. But sometimes we don't really have business asking certain questions. Just because we're curious doesn't necessarily mean we need to have that information about a student. We should allow them to share with us what they're comfortable sharing with us, and we should know just enough to help them however they need to be helped. And so that's just something to keep in mind while you're working with them as well. As we talk about intake forms and things like that, if you end up creating something like that, just be mindful and sensitive to the experiences of your students.
Yeah, and I think that's also what we call it, an appointment request, to kind of destigmatize it. I mean, if they're coming to college, they want to be a college student. They don't want to. They don't want to still be in like high school or middle school mode. And so, I totally agree with what Brenda's saying about being sensitive to that. The other point on that is also being an advocate for them not having to tell their story 10,000 times. So if there's like with financial aid, for example, they're bound by compliance with the U.S. Department of Education. So if you need a special circumstance to be able to adjust their aid, like let's say they're not making satisfactory academic progress, so you're making an appeal. Well, they're required by the federal government to give a lot of detail, but we can help work with them on that so that it's not traumatizing having to apply for this request. So I think when we work with our colleagues around that, people are on board with that. They just don't know how to do it. So a question I get all the time is, well, how do you talk to students who might have been in care without causing harm? And so, especially when I'm talking to admission staff who are working with prospective students. And so what I do is just try to normalize it all. Just say, when I'm working with a student I don't know, I'll just say, the university, we have one of our roles is helping students figure out resources you might be eligible for. And I don't know your experience. You don't have to share it with me right now, but I want you to know, like, we have funding for if you've served in the military, or there's funding also available if you've experienced foster care. If I have the whole list on my fingertips, and I just throw it in there with the others. so that they can share that at that point in a way that feels not threatening. Because the part Brenda's saying about the time to build rapport and trust, that is real. That's why the student organization takes time, building one anyway.
For sure. And I like the word advocacy. We do kind of provide, I think these quasi case management services kind of on campus in a lot of ways, but I like to refer to them as advocacy services. They've been case managed their whole childhood in a lot of situations, and circumstances. And so that's kind of a scary word. We really do. We want to normalize the college experience for them, and always, including the struggles that normal college students would have. And so just be careful with the language that you use with them, and make sure it's empowering language and not something that holds them back or makes them feel like they're still part of a system that they're so glad to be out of.
But I do love the nature of your question, because one of the things I've tried to figure out is on the backside, how can I be more systematic with knowing who's applied for what benefits, who should be thinking about benefits they might not be getting. And I don't have a great system. I mean, I have one that's sort of working, but I would love to know that, like how people manage on the backside, keeping up with all these different situations, and also knowing when deadlines are coming up that we can help remind people. So it's a good question.
And I think that the form also helps, because I think that's my problem, is I'm really scared to approach it the wrong way. Like I want to be very sensitive. I want to be very cautious at the way I approach it. And I know that some of them might take some things as some things offensive that others may not. Like I've heard that even considering them foster care alumni, that they don't appreciate that, some of them. And so I don't just little things like that. I don't want to offend them. I don't want them to make them feel uncomfortable in any way. So I think knowing the right questions to ask is maybe a better way to approach them a little bit easier without offending them, I guess. I overanalyze it all. So I just want to make sure not to upset them or turn them away. I want them to feel comfortable.
Right. And on the flip side of that, sometimes they share a lot with you where you might be really surprised, right? With what they're willing to share. And that can be kind of hard to hear sometimes as well. And so, just helping them navigate those conversations and supporting them while they're sharing freely, or maybe, because we're not counselors. I mean, some of you guys might be, but I'm a clinical social worker, but my role is not to be the counselor or therapist for my foster care alumni. And so I will definitely make a referral out to like our counseling office or our psychology clinic, as appropriate, just maintaining those boundaries with students. I'll hear them out, we'll have a conversation, and then I'll make sure to send them where they need to go to get the support that they need.
But this is one thing we're running out of time, and this topic I'm about to say is a monster of a topic unto itself. But something, Brenda, we should think about for next year are all the new changes to Title IX. Title IX we are all mandatory reporters, and I feel like we need to be really clear with students the minute they say anything personal. Like I have to report this. So anyway, just a little side note to just end on a note that makes it even more complicated.
Yeah, we call that communication. So that's big. Yeah, that's for a whole other training. But again, you all, we just thank you for being here, taking your time to learn this afternoon. Amy and I would love to be a resource